Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I woke drenched in sweat, my heart hammering so violently against my ribs that I thought it might burst through my chest. Even before my eyes fully adjusted to the darkness, I knew something was terribly wrong. The air felt stale and heavy, as though the walls themselves had closed in during the night. The taste in my mouth was bitter, a brackish tang of panic. I sensed movement near the foot of the bed, a flicker of black that vanished the instant I tried to focus on it. Yet the impression remained, lingering like a primal warning. In that quiet moment, as I tried to calm my ragged breathing, I remembered every rumor I had heard about this apartment building. And I realized with a chill that nothing in my life had ever felt so menacing. I have always been prone to catching glimpses of things most people never see. Since adolescence, there has been a part of me that seems especially receptive to eerie undercurrents. In empty hallways, I would sometimes catch a shape darting around a corner, only to find no one there. I used to wake in the middle of the night to a sensation of someone, or something, watching me. But it was always subtle, like the flicker of a shadow in the corner of your eye that dissolves the moment you turn your head. My mother once suggested I see a therapist about my insomnia, but I dismissed the idea, convinced I just had an overactive imagination. Over the years, I learned to live with those unsettling impressions, treating them like background noise that occasionally spiked into full-blown dread. When I finally moved out on my own, I chose this building because of its low rent and convenient location. The owners claimed it was an old architectural gem, though neglected in places, creaky floors, walls with peeling wallpaper, and outdated lighting. Part of me was fascinated by the sense of history embedded in the stained banisters and the scuffed molding around each doorframe. It felt like stepping into another era, and I believed the place had a certain austere charm. Yet from the first night, I noticed how quiet the hallways became after dark. Not just a regular silence, but a pervasive hush that pressed on my ears and made me uneasy. No neighbors played music, no one slammed doors. Even the elevator descended with a hushed mechanical groan that seemed reluctant to break the tension. I tried to tell myself that this was only my imagination. After all, I had always been sensitive to unusual atmospheres, and my new surroundings were bound to make me anxious. But each day, something small would happen to deepen my discomfort. The apartment's lights flickered whenever I paced around at night, as if they were responding to my internal restlessness. Occasionally, I would think I heard a muffled voice from the living room, soft and agitated, but there was never anyone there. My furniture would creak on its own, as though the weight of an unseen figure had just shifted. Nothing dramatic, yet enough to set my teeth on edge. One evening, as I was browsing the internet in an attempt to numb my nerves, I sensed a movement in the corner of my peripheral vision. A dark outline seemed to lean out from behind the open doorway to the corridor. My throat went dry as I whipped my head around. Of course, the doorway was empty, revealing only the dimly lit corridor behind it. But my heart thudded uncomfortably hard, and I could not shake the certainty that something had just been there. From that moment, my paranoia began escalating. Every clink of the ancient radiator made me jump. Every shift of the shadows under the weak overhead bulb made my palms sweat. I found myself fighting an urge to run outside at all hours of the night, just to escape the suffocating hush of those rooms. I confided in a close friend during a phone call, explaining that I was convinced some presence was feeding off my tension. My friend seemed concerned, advising me to perhaps burn sage or keep a small protective talisman. I tried both. The pungent smoke made my eyes water, and I felt a momentary sense of relief, but it faded by the next day. The talisman, a small piece of polished obsidian, became nothing more than a worry stone that I fidgeted with in my pocket. No matter how many times I repeated short prayers under my breath or tried to visualize bright light enveloping the apartment, that sense of being watched remained. One night, I woke to a suffocating stillness. My chest felt tight, and the air in the room was so thick I could taste my own fear. It felt like a presence had settled right next to me, an immense weight on the edge of the mattress. The hair on my arms stood on end, and I was too petrified to roll over. I listened, ears straining over the rush of my pulse for any breath besides my own. There was nothing but silence. Yet I could have sworn there was a shape beside me, something tall, draped in shadow, leaning slightly as if it were studying my face. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, to shout for help, but my body refused to obey. Eventually, the oppressive sensation lifted, and I lay there trembling until sunrise. That marked a turning point. The next morning, every corner of the apartment looked sinister to me. Sunlight poured in through the windows, but the shadows felt darker than they should. My reflection in the bathroom mirror had a hollow look around the eyes, as if I had lost several nights of sleep in a single evening. The faint lines of the wallpaper twisted into shapes that reminded me of contorted faces, though I told myself it was just my frayed nerves distorting my perception. I forced down half a cup of coffee, struggling to keep my hands steady, and decided to investigate the building's history. If nothing else, I hoped to soothe my imagination by verifying there was no real reason to feel so haunted. At the local library, I combed through old newspapers and property records. There were numerous ownership changes, many complaints about structural issues, but no explicit mention of tragedies or cursed histories. Nothing that would justify the low rent, aside from the place needing extensive renovations. Yet as I read those brittle documents, I felt inexplicably uneasy, as though something hid between the lines. I couldn't shake the feeling that all these mundane records were a veneer masking something deeper. I also caught glimpses of a janitor in the corner of my eye, an elderly man sorting through files near me, but whenever I turned to acknowledge him, he was nowhere to be found. My heart pounded at the thought that my paranoia was following me outside the apartment as well. I returned home that night with an armful of books on supernatural folklore and spiritual cleansing. Though I had never been particularly religious, desperation drove me to try anything that might offer a solution. I skimmed through chapters on banishing rituals, wards, and protective symbols, feeling a faint flicker of hope. Yet each attempt I made at home, lighting white candles in a circle, sprinkling salt along the thresholds, reciting half-remembered incantations, seemed only to amplify the oppressive atmosphere. The shadows lengthened whenever the candles flickered, stretching across the floor like predatory limbs. My throat constricted each time the apartment settled with a hiss or groan. At night, I would snap awake without warning, convinced something was whispering my name. The words were indecipherable, but the intent felt threatening, a warning that I was overstepping. After one particularly harrowing evening where I felt hands, or maybe claws, gripping my shoulders as I dozed off, I decided to seek professional help. Not from a psychiatrist, but from someone claiming to specialize in the paranormal. Through an acquaintance, I was put in touch with a self-proclaimed medium who agreed to meet me in a nearby cafe. The medium glanced at me with a sympathetic expression, asking pointed questions about my past experiences and my emotional state. She mentioned that certain individuals, especially those with heightened sensitivities, could attract energies that feed on fear. She suggested that I try meditation and grounding exercises, encouraging me to confront whatever presence I felt instead of running from it. I left the conversation more anxious than reassured, uncertain whether I had found practical advice or just fed into my own superstitions. Back in my apartment, I forced myself to walk the halls in total darkness, step by trembling step, hoping to desensitize myself to the dread. My heart pounded against my ribcage like a warning drum, and each breath felt like I was inhaling shards of ice. Down the corridor, a mirror hung crookedly, reflecting the vague outlines of my shape under the dim glow from a distant street lamp. As I inched closer, the reflection began to ripple in my peripheral vision, as though the glass were warping. For a split second, I thought I saw another figure behind me, impossibly tall and featureless. But when I whipped around, the corridor stood empty. My stomach clenched with the realization that my mind or my eyes could be betraying me. In the following days, I tried everything to reclaim a sense of normalcy. I rearranged furniture, hoping a different layout might break the dark illusions. I filled the space with bright lamps, creating a fortress of light. Yet the gloom seemed to creep back in, as if it clung to the corners of the apartment. My attempts to ignore it only magnified that crawling sensation under my skin, the certainty of being watched. At times, I would feel a chill breeze brush past me in rooms with no open windows or ventilation. Other times, the entire apartment would feel stiflingly hot, sweat beading on my forehead even though the thermostat read a normal temperature. My moods grew erratic. One minute, I was convinced I could fight this presence and claim my space. The next, I was so overwhelmed by dread that I contemplated leaving the apartment altogether. The worst was the persistent sense that something was siphoning my most sinister thoughts, feasting on my private fears. I would dwell on uncertainties about my future, the pangs of loneliness that gnawed at me late at night, or regret over past decisions. Each time a despairing thought crossed my mind, the walls seemed to tighten, as though the building itself was resonating with my negativity. I recalled the medium's warning about certain entities thriving on heightened emotional energy. The realization chilled me. Perhaps my own psychic vulnerability had drawn something malignant out of the shadows. I redoubled my efforts to break free. On a recommendation, I tried to draw protective symbols around the windows and doors. As I was finishing the last one, I heard a scraping sound behind me, like nails dragging across the hardwood floor. I spun around, adrenaline flooding my veins, but saw nothing. The tension was so thick it almost weighed me down physically, and a nauseating swirl of panic rose in my gut. In that moment, an overwhelming certainty washed over me. No matter how many wards I tried, this presence was not going to let me go without a fight. Then, on a night when sleep had become impossible, I lay awake with the lamp on, watching the shadows cast on the wall. My breath was shallow, each inhale and exhale a reminder of my accelerating pulse. Suddenly the lamp sputtered, and every filament of light flickered. The shadows on the wall expanded, their shapes twisting into something that defied logical explanation. My entire body tensed as I felt the mattress sink near my ankles. It was happening again. This time I forced myself to lift my head and look. There was an outline, vague, dark, but unmistakably humanoid, perched at the edge of the bed. My stomach lurched. My pulse throbbed in my ears so loudly I thought they might burst. A clammy sweat coated my skin as I tried to steady my breathing. Though I couldn't see any facial features, I sensed an intense scrutiny from this entity. I recalled the medium's words, "Face it." And so, with every ounce of courage I could muster, I sat up. My body trembled violently, and my voice cracked with fear as I attempted to speak, but my throat refused to form coherent words. In my head, I tried to project a firm demand that it leave me alone, that this was my space. The shape did not vanish, but rather leaned in closer as though mocking me. Everything felt distorted. Time seemed to slow, and the edges of my vision blurred. My mind teetered on the brink of hysteria. Then, in an instant, the room's light returned to normal. The weight lifted from the bed. The silhouette dissolved into the ambient darkness, leaving behind the suffocating hush. Every muscle in my body went limp, and I collapsed back onto the pillow, gasping for air. I understood then. I would never truly be rid of this thing if I simply hid behind wards and rituals. The following day, I made a decision. I had to leave. I shoved my belongings into boxes with frantic haste, trying not to glance at the corners of the room. My heart pounded at the thought of what might be lurking behind me, but I refused to give in to the panic. Each time a floorboard creaked or a shadow flickered, I forced myself to stay calm. My instincts screamed that fleeing might be the only way to preserve my sanity. Even then, I knew deep down this presence might follow me wherever I went. But I had to attempt an escape, to break the cycle. When I finally dragged the last of my boxes into the hallway, the oppressive silence pressed in with renewed vigor. It felt like a warning, as though the apartment itself was exerting one final hold. My chest tightened, sweat trickled down my back, and I almost lost the nerve. But I forced myself to move. With trembling hands, I locked the door behind me, feeling a surge of dread twist in my gut. I took one last glance at that peeling wallpaper, half expecting to see the shape from my nightmares. There was nothing but shadow. Outside, the sky was a dull gray, a drizzle turning the streets slick and shiny. Even so, the damp air felt like a blessing compared to the suffocating weight inside. My heartbeat remained unsteady, my mouth dry, and the adrenaline still coursed through me. Yet for the first time in weeks, I could breathe without the sense that something hovered just beyond my field of vision. I told myself I was making the right choice, that leaving was the only logical option. A small, nagging thought tugged at my mind, though. It might not be over. Whatever fed on my fear could still be tethered to my psyche, and no matter how far I ran, it might find ways to reappear in the corners of my life. I stared up at the rows of windows, each one reflecting the bleak sky. My own reflection wavered in the glass, looking frazzled and worn. In the back of my mind, I felt that heaviness, that intangible presence that had infested my every moment. Even if the apartment was behind me now, the memory of that silhouette would be forever etched into my consciousness. As I turned away, pulling my coat tighter against the drizzle, I felt an icy shiver crawl up my spine, a sensation that made me wonder if, despite my best efforts, I could truly leave this nightmare behind. And in that final, chilling instant, I understood that some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. I remember that first night as if it were carved into my mind, vivid and unyielding. The air in the old house seemed to hum with tension, as though something unseen lingered behind every door. It was the sort of place where one felt compelled to whisper, even when no one else was around. The floorboards creaked in the silence, and the walls themselves felt too close, as though they were alive, listening, breathing, waiting. I arrived with a sense of unease already pulsing at the base of my skull. It was just an old rental my colleague had found, but from the moment I stepped inside, I had the unsettling feeling that we were trespassing on something's territory. We didn't know it then, but that single discovery in the attic would unravel our sense of safety and lead us into a downward spiral of dread. When I agreed to help my colleague sort through boxes in the musty attic, I merely thought we'd find old newspapers or maybe some forgotten keepsakes. The place smelled like damp cardboard and stale air, with cobwebs draped in the rafters like tattered curtains. We combed through piles of yellowed books, broken lamps, and moth-eaten blankets, occasionally exchanging murmured remarks that it felt odd up there. Eventually, we uncovered a small wooden chest near the back wall, almost hidden beneath a torn sheet. Inside was a board unlike anything I had seen before, its surface a swirl of dark stains and cryptic symbols. I thought it might be a homemade talking board or some kind of archaic game. My colleague muttered in an uneasy tone that we should bring it downstairs, and out of sheer curiosity, see what would happen if we tinkered with it. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Downstairs, the living room felt equally dreary, illuminated by a single floor lamp that offered barely enough light to read by. I set the board on the coffee table, expecting nothing more than a silly pastime. We made half-hearted attempts to summon whatever might dwell beyond our sight, chuckling nervously at our own melodramatic behavior. It felt absurd, yet the tension in our voices suggested we were a bit more spooked than we cared to admit. I could feel my heartbeat quicken as we placed our hands lightly on a makeshift pointer. It was all in fun until the first noise. It started as a soft thump from beneath the floorboards, as if someone were walking around in the basement with shoes too big for their feet. I froze, my fingers turning clammy. My colleague tried to brush it off, but his expression betrayed a flicker of alarm. Then came the slow, dragging sound of something heavy scraping across the floor below us. I felt my scalp tighten. We set the board aside, certain that we must have disturbed something in the process. Suddenly, a sharp rap on the living room wall made me jolt. The walls were thin, so it wasn't unusual to hear the pipes moan or the old wood groan. But this felt different, like an intentional knock in direct response to our actions. That was the moment I realized I couldn't dismiss what was happening as mere coincidence. My pulse throbbed in my ears and I found myself breathing through my mouth, each inhale more shallow than the last. The light above us flickered once, twice, and then held steady. My colleague and I exchanged worried glances. I didn't speak much. I only managed to whisper under my breath that we should put the board away for the night. I carried it back up the creaking attic steps, each step punctuated by the sound of my own breathing. I wish I could say that was the end of it, but the events only escalated from there. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to the distinct shuffle of footsteps in the hallway, accompanied by the feeling that someone was standing right outside my door. My heart would pound so fiercely I worried it might wake the entire neighborhood. I'd muster the courage to flip on the lamp, only to find the corridor empty, but the sense of being watched clung to me like a wet blanket. Every small noise became an alarm. The squeak of a loose board, the tap of a branch against the window, each sound crawled under my skin. More than once I discovered doors standing wide open after I was sure I had closed them. Drawers that I distinctly remembered shutting were pulled out just an inch or two, enough to send chills down my spine. One particular night I found the basement door ajar when it was supposed to be locked. I couldn't recall unlocking it, and my colleague insisted he hadn't been down there at all. Strange marks began appearing on my arms, faint at first, light bruises that I tried to blame on my own clumsiness. I thought maybe I bumped into a table corner or pressed my arms against something while I slept, but they grew darker, with a distinct shape, the outline of fingertips, as though invisible hands had gripped me. On more than one morning, I woke gasping, drenched in cold sweat, with those new bruises throbbing on my skin. My colleague noticed and asked indirectly if I was hurting myself. I told him I was just as baffled as he was. The worst moment happened 1 week after we found the board. I had decided to move it to a little used closet on the first floor, thinking that perhaps if I didn't go up to the attic, I could forget the board existed. The atmosphere in the hallway was heavy, like walking through a humid storm. My chest felt tight, and every hair on my arm stood on end. I held the board pressed against my body, turning the doorknob to the closet with my free hand. The moment I swung that door open, I felt something icy graze the back of my neck, followed by a tug on my shoulder so forceful it spun me around. I nearly dropped the board, my breath caught in my throat, and for a split second, I stood in a suffocating silence, convinced I was face to face with something not meant to be seen. The hallway light flickered violently, plunging me into half-darkness. When it steadied, I was alone. But my shoulder felt numb, and a frigid chill lingered there. After that, I couldn't shake the impression that I was being observed at all times. Even in broad daylight, I'd sense movement in my peripheral vision. My appetite vanished, replaced by a gnawing anxiety that settled in my stomach. I spent most afternoons locked in my room with the blinds drawn, attempting to read or distract myself, but I couldn't concentrate. I felt the walls pressing in, like the house itself was trying to smother me. My colleague tiptoed around me, clearly unnerved by the changes in my behavior, but neither of us openly acknowledged our growing terror. We spoke in low tones, discussing only the basics: food, rent, chores. We never discussed the board in any real depth. It was like we tacitly agreed that speaking about it would only feed whatever was happening. At night, those dragging footsteps became more pronounced. They seemed to start in the living room, then migrate to the kitchen, sometimes stopping right outside my room. I'd lie in bed with shallow breathing, my heart pounding like a hammer, hoping against hope that nothing would try the doorknob. Sometimes it would rattle, just faintly, enough to set my nerves alight. I felt nauseated by how powerless I was against it. More than once I questioned if I was imagining everything. Maybe I was experiencing severe stress, or a hallucination brought on by lack of sleep. But the bruises on my arms and the flickering lights were real, and my colleague was seeing it too. We couldn't both be hallucinating the exact same events. Eventually, I decided that returning the board to the attic might be the key to restoring peace. One quiet afternoon, when the sun was just starting to dip behind the neighboring houses, I retrieved the board from that first-floor closet. The hallway was bathed in dim, golden light that did nothing to ease my dread. My palms were sweating so much I nearly dropped the board on the stairs. Ascending to the attic felt like walking into a tomb. Dust motes floated in the slanted beams of light, and the smell of old cardboard returned. I placed the board in the same chest we'd found it in, draped the sheet over it once more, and stood there, breath held, waiting for some sign of approval or rejection. Nothing obvious happened. The dust-laden silence remained. I exhaled slowly, the tension in my body easing just a fraction. I closed the chest and left the attic, determined not to return. I wish I could say everything went back to normal after that. It didn't, not fully anyway. The immediate intensity of the phenomena subsided, but small occurrences persisted. The bruises stopped appearing, though I still had faint discolorations that took weeks to fade. Sometimes I would pass by the attic door and feel a curious tingling on my skin, like an electric charge in the air. Lights would flicker now and then, and I'd catch myself listening for footsteps when the house was at its quietest. More than once, I heard dull scraping somewhere in the walls, though it never came as close as it had before. My nights were more manageable, but I never slept as peacefully as I once had. A suspicion tugged at me, a sense that something was merely biding its time. I found myself scouring online forums about haunted objects and cursed boards, looking for any explanation that fit my experiences. Most of what I read sounded too theatrical, like scenes ripped from low-budget horror movies. I couldn't reconcile any of that with the visceral terror I had felt. None of the stories described the same creeping dread, the paralyzing cold I had felt on my shoulder, or the maddening sense of being constantly observed. So I put it out of my mind as best I could. I still jumped at the faintest creak, but day by day, I tried to normalize my life. My colleague seldom brought it up, as though reluctant to reopen that wound. Yet I remained convinced that the house had changed me. Even mundane tasks, like washing dishes or taking out the trash, took on a sharper edge. I stayed hyper-aware of my environment, the hairs on the back of my neck perpetually on standby, braced for another sign that we had unsettled something. Occasionally I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the bathroom mirror, noticing my pale complexion and the dark circles under my eyes. I was a far cry from the person who had first entered that house. I felt like a fraction of myself had been lost somewhere in the gloom of the attic, replaced by a permanent wariness. One evening, as I was packing my things for a short trip out of town, I noticed the attic door was slightly ajar. I knew I had left it shut. My stomach dropped. For a moment I stood at the foot of the attic stairs, overwhelmed by the memory of what had happened up there. I felt that old surge of fear sharpen my senses. Accelerated heartbeat, damp palms, muscles tensing for fight or flight. In that moment, I wanted to bolt out the front door and never return. But I took a slow breath and climbed those steps once more. The overhead light flickered to life, revealing the same chest in the corner, the same dust swirling in the air. Nothing looked disturbed, but I couldn't shake the impression that something intangible was waiting. I slid the door closed behind me and walked away, my legs trembling. I left for my trip early the next morning, relief washing over me the moment I drove away from the property. In the days that followed, I slept more soundly than I had in weeks, though there was always a gnawing sensation in the back of my mind reminding me I would eventually return. When I did come back to the old house, it was quiet. The first few hours I spent there were almost peaceful. No flickering lights, no unusual knocks. Yet, it felt like walking on thin ice, aware that one wrong step could send everything crashing back into chaos. Despite all the unsettling experiences, I never found definitive proof of what lurked in that house. I never saw an apparition, never recorded an inexplicable voice, never found a trail of footprints to follow. What I did have were faint memories of cold fingers on my shoulder, bruises on my arms, and a terror that was so real I can still feel it clutch at my chest if I think about it too long. Eventually, I moved out. My colleague did too, admitting he couldn't endure the oppressive atmosphere anymore. To this day, I can't be sure if I escaped or if I merely brought a piece of that darkness with me. At times, late at night in my new apartment, I imagine I hear those same dragging footsteps down the hall. The wind rattles a window or a door creaks, and my breath catches in my throat. Perhaps the board remains in the attic of that old house, gathering dust and waiting for the next person who can't resist its pull. Sometimes I wonder if whatever manifested was always there, hidden in the beams and shadows, and the board was nothing more than a key we foolishly turned. I live with a subtle unease now, a lingering awareness that reality can tear open at the edges to reveal things we're not prepared to face. I may no longer wake each morning to fresh bruises, but the memory of that icy grip is enough to remind me how thin the barrier is between what we know and what we fear. And in quiet moments, I catch myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see a flicker in the corner of my vision, an echo of whatever still watches from the hidden corners of an old, silent attic. The first time I sensed something was wrong, the air itself felt heavier, almost electric with tension, as though it resisted my every breath. Even the morning light, usually so gentle in my part of the countryside, seemed strained and sickly, draining color from the distant tree line. I had lived in that remote region for years, lulled by the placid routine of farmland and thick forest. But on that day, nothing felt familiar or welcoming. I could not have known that, by taking a simple shortcut through the woods, I would plunge myself into an unsettling mystery that still refuses to leave my thoughts. I was heading to a neighboring homestead to assist with repairs on a barn roof when I decided to cut across a section of forest I rarely visited. It was early in the day, and the autumn air was crisp enough to keep me alert. I moved quickly, my boots crunching leaves that were slick from morning dew. The path was narrower than I remembered, choked by overgrowth and briars that tugged at my jacket. Despite the obstacles, I felt inexplicably drawn forward, as if some hidden impulse demanded I continue. My pulse quickened with anticipation, though I dismissed it as the simple thrill of exploring an unfamiliar route. Deeper into the thicket, I found a clearing dappled by pale sunlight. Standing in the middle of that clearing were three strangers. They wore old-fashioned clothes, high collars, worn vests, and long skirts that looked as though they belonged in a faded photograph from decades ago. Their faces, turned toward me, lacked the hard lines one expects from farmers accustomed to rough labor. Instead, there was an unsettling smoothness in their expressions, almost as though someone had smeared their features with a brush. At first, I thought the glare was playing tricks on my eyes. I attempted to focus on their eyes, but every time I tried, my vision seemed to blur. One of them, a tall figure with an oddly gentle gait, motioned for me to come closer, indicating they were building a small cabin in the clearing. They urged me, using a tranquil tone, to see their progress. My heart pounded with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. From a respectful distance, I noticed freshly cut logs, a rudimentary frame, and tools that looked antique. Rust clung to the metal edges as though they had been stashed away for ages before coming back into use. The group spoke calmly of their plans, hinting that they wanted a secluded place where they could conduct personal work free from any prying eyes. There was no outright mention of what this work might be, only vague assurances that it was important for the land. My instincts told me something about the situation was off, but I found myself inexplicably charmed by their quiet confidence. Each time they addressed me, it felt as though a thin veil of warmth enveloped my mind, dulling the logical part that should have questioned everything. Even their old-fashioned way of speaking, though subdued, made my nerves tingle. There was no direct invitation to stay for long. They only suggested that I might return if I ever wished to see how the project progressed. After a brief time lingering in the clearing, I forced myself to leave, making polite excuses. My heart hammered harder as I backed away, unsure why I felt both drawn and repelled by these strangers. The entire trek to my neighbor's place, I could not shake the sense that I had stepped out of my familiar world into a place that didn't quite belong. The forest seemed darker than usual, the underbrush layered with shadows even under midday light, as though the sun had retreated to a safer distance. By the time I reached my destination, a sheen of cold sweat clung to the back of my neck. Over the next several days, I found my thoughts returning again and again to that clearing and its mysterious occupants. My chores around the property felt stiflingly dull, and my sleep became restless. I kept dreaming of the forest, hearing something call my name in a voice that sounded both kind and dispassionate. Every morning, I awoke with my heart racing and my sheets damp with perspiration. I told myself these dreams were the product of an overactive imagination, but the sense of unease wouldn't loosen its hold on me. Eventually, I decided to go back to that clearing, hoping to reassure myself that I had imagined nothing more than a few eccentric people living off the grid. The day was damp and cold, a drizzle clinging to my hair and dripping down my cheeks as I retraced my steps. Yet when I arrived, I found only rotting boards scattered across the ground, thick moss covering what I recognized as the same logs. The distinct shape of a cabin frame was gone, replaced by shards of disintegrated lumber, darkened with the patina of age. Where the tools had once stood, rusted lumps sank into the soil. It was as though decades had passed since anyone had dared to build on that spot. My throat went dry, and my breath caught in painful gulps. It made no sense. Less than a week had gone by. Certainly not enough time for this level of decay. I circled the clearing, scanning the ground for footprints or any sign that the three strangers had come back. The only impressions I could see were my own, trailing across the muddy earth. Even the undergrowth I had remembered near the edges looked different. Overgrown branches and knotted roots twisting in patterns too complex to be natural. A fierce wind tore through the trees, stinging my eyes with tiny flecks of debris. The forest itself seemed eager to drive me out. That same night, I began hearing voices just beyond my fields. They were faint, almost drowned by the whisper of wind through the pines, but unmistakably human in tone. At first, I could not make out any words, only the cadence of distant calling. Something in those voices reminded me of how the three strangers had spoken, calm, measured, and cloaked in timelessness. When I stepped onto my porch, straining my ears toward the tree line, I experienced a sudden wave of dizziness, as though invisible hands pressed me back. I found myself trapped in a cycle. My curiosity demanded I investigate, but each time I tried to walk into the woods at night, the air seemed thicker, heavier. The trees loomed like silent sentinels. Shadows writhed beneath their canopies, and the path became a corridor of uncertainty, every rustle and crack magnified until I felt sure I was not alone. More than once I turned back with my heart pounding, convinced that if I went any farther, I would be stepping into a place where I did not belong. Sleep gave little refuge. My dreams grew more vivid, and the calling voices no longer restricted themselves to the outskirts of my consciousness. In my mind, they echoed from inside my own house, drifting through halls that appeared distorted, as though I were seeing them through warped glass. When I would snap awake, I found myself drenched in sweat, chest heaving as if I had run miles. My lungs ached, and a tremor ran through my limbs. Sometimes the calling would continue faintly even after I sat upright, as if daring me to follow. During the day, I tried to rationalize what was happening. I suspected some trick of the mind. Perhaps I had stumbled upon an old homestead and confused the timeline of its ruin. Maybe the strangers were a group of local reenactors, or enthusiastic restorationists using antique tools, and the night voices could be the effect of the wind combined with my own anxious state. But logic could not explain how those logs had decayed so quickly, nor why my entire body rebelled whenever I tried to re-enter the clearing. I confided in a close friend who lived a few miles away, explaining, without much detail, that something about the forest felt wrong. He suggested that I was overworked, that the isolation was taking a toll on my mind. He advised me to stay away from those woods until I felt more at ease. His concern was genuine, but did little to quell my growing apprehension. Each day I felt a building tension beneath my skin, my pulse rarely settling below a frantic rhythm. Within a week, I could no longer avoid the need to see for myself what lurked beyond that threshold of trees. One evening, equipped with a strong flashlight and a will bolstered by desperation, I ventured to the edge of the forest. The night was chillingly quiet. Even the usual chorus of insects had fallen silent, as though they too feared drawing attention. My footsteps were the only sound, each step an echo in the stillness. My heart pounded so violently I could feel my ribcage tremble. Soon I heard that same spectral calling. It emanated from deeper within, where the clearing waited. Every time I advanced, the temperature seemed to drop, and the breeze carried an almost mournful tone. My vision blurred at the edges, and a twisting pressure formed at the back of my head. I fought the urge to turn around, forcing my body forward, determined to unravel this mystery. But as I neared the place where I expected the rotted boards to be, an overwhelming force pressed into my chest. It felt like walking against an unseen tide. Each movement required extraordinary effort, my limbs shaking from the resistance. A raw panic lodged in my throat. My breath came in short, ragged bursts. Cold sweat trickled down my forehead, and my eyes stung. I steadied myself against a gnarled trunk, shining my flashlight ahead. The beam cut through the darkness and revealed a cluster of broken timber. For a fleeting moment, I thought I could make out silhouettes. 3 figures standing motionless behind those ruins, their faces still indistinct. It was as if time wavered around them, causing the edges of their forms to flicker. An unshakable dread seized me. It was not simply fear of the unknown, but a primal certainty that I was trespassing into something that did not want me there. My skin prickled, and my ears pounded with the thunder of my pulse. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to retreat. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. Despite my determination, I could not advance further. That invisible barrier, thick as a wall of water, pushed me away, draining my resolve. After several desperate attempts, I turned and fled, crashing through branches and undergrowth until I reached my fields, lungs burning, tears stinging my eyes for reasons I still cannot entirely articulate. From that night on, my life was swallowed by a sense of perpetual unease. Even within my home, I felt as though the forest were creeping toward me, extending its darkness to my doorstep. Ordinary sounds, the wind against the shutters, the creaks of the old timber floors, became suspect. My nerves were frayed, leaving me on constant alert for the next unexplainable phenomenon. Sleep was a battleground, a realm where the voices grew clearer, whispering cryptic phrases I could not recall fully upon waking. My dreams were dominated by images of the clearing, the half-built cabin flickering between states of newness and decrepitude. As the days stretched into weeks, I fought to maintain a grip on my sanity. Practical tasks became monumental challenges. My appetite waned, and when I did manage to eat, my stomach churned from tension. Occasional fleeting glimpses by the forest's edge, shapes moving in the corner of my vision, made me doubt my own senses. Each time I turned to look directly, there would be nothing but the swaying branches and shifting moonlight. Yet, the suffocating impression of being watched never left me. At last, desperation overcame me. I decided I would face that clearing in broad daylight, believing the sun might offer some protection from the oppressive presence. My steps were unsteady as I marched through the forest once more. The morning light was harsh, slicing through the trees in sharp angles, illuminating dust motes that danced in the stale air. The forest smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves, a cloying scent that made me gag. I pressed on until I arrived at the familiar spot. The remains of the cabin were exactly as before, rotting timber and rusted implements scattered like evidence of an abandoned world. No sign of the strangers, no blurred silhouettes. But the hush was unnerving, and the longer I stood there, the more I felt that same oppressive force. A chill clawed its way into my bones, and every breath felt labored. My heart pounded with such intensity that my hands trembled. The silence was so absolute that I could hear my own blood rushing in my ears. I sensed that I was still unwelcome, that the clearing itself was rejecting my presence. A wave of nausea rolled through me, and my vision dimmed around the edges, as though the trees had closed in. Summoning what remained of my courage, I dropped to one knee and pressed my palm against the earth, hoping to feel something tangible that might anchor me. I felt nothing but cold, damp soil. No hidden door, no cryptic symbol carved into the ground, yet the space around me seemed to hum with a barely suppressed power. one that was older and more complex than I could fathom. A final surge of dizziness overcame me, and I realized I had to leave immediately if I hoped to keep my grip on reality. Stumbling to my feet, I half ran, half staggered back along the overgrown trail, branches scratching my arms like thin, skeletal fingers trying to hold me back. Upon returning to the familiar edge of my property, I felt as though I had escaped from a dream turned nightmare. My limbs felt leaden, my breathing ragged, and the pounding of my heart reverberated in every muscle. Although I had managed to leave the clearing again, I carried the distinct impression that I could never fully free myself from its influence. It lingered in my mind, an intrusive thought that refused to fade, always reminding me of what I had encountered. Even now, as I sit at my simple wooden table, writing these words by the dim light of a single lamp, I feel an underlying tension in the air. The forest outside my window is motionless in the moonlight, as though it is holding its breath. My throat feels tight, and my fingertips tremble against the page. I have tried to share my experiences with others, only to receive polite skepticism or vague concern. A few suggest I should simply sell my place and move away. Perhaps that would bring respite, but some deeper instinct warns me that whatever lies in that clearing is not bound by geography. It reached out once, reeling me in with those blurred faces and promises of hidden work, and it could do so again wherever I go. I have decided to remain, not from bravery, but from a compulsion to uncover the truth. The glimpses I have caught, the rotted cabin that should not be rotted, the voices calling in the night, the sense of a secret older than I can comprehend, have altered my perception of reality. Whether it is a force tied to the land or a product of an overtaxed mind, I cannot say, but I feel its presence each time I approach that part of the woods. A potent reminder that some boundaries are guarded for reasons beyond human understanding. My sanity clings to the notion that there must be a rational explanation, but in my heart, I suspect that rationality is insufficient to explain the unnatural. So I wait, gripped by a vigilant terror. Night after night I sit in darkness, listening to the wind for that familiar calling. Sometimes it resonates on the edge of hearing, other times there is only silence. Even in that silence, though, I sense watchful eyes. My body tenses at the slightest sound, a jolt of adrenaline flooding my veins. Yet I have found no clear answers, no resolution. My only certainty is the oppressive weight of that clearing in my memory, as though it is a living thing, breathing in the hush of the forest. It repels me, and yet it beckons me, taunting my inability to make sense of it. I suspect I may never truly escape. Still, as long as I do not venture too far into its domain, it seems to let me exist on the periphery. Perhaps that is the most disturbing conclusion of all, that I am permitted to remain here only by whatever ancient design haunts those woods. And so my life continues in uneasy coexistence with this mystery, my nights spent anticipating a final revelation that may never come. The dread never leaves. It burrows deep under my skin, coiling around each heartbeat. Even if I somehow manage to move away one day, the memory of that decaying cabin and those blurred figures will follow me. The forest keeps its secrets close, and I have learned they are not secrets meant for outsiders to uncover. Yet I live on, suspended between fear and necessity, haunted but alive. Every dawn, I feel a slight loosening of the tightness in my chest, an incremental reprieve. But the relief is always partial, temporary at best. I have come to accept that no matter how many times I see that cabin's ruins, or how many times I sense a presence repelling me, I will never fully understand. In the meantime, I remain vigilant, my senses sharpened by dread. The terror has become a part of me, a persistent shadow in my peripheral vision. And if the forest calls again, I am prepared, though not at all eager, to answer. I felt something watching me from the very moment I stepped into the house that night. The air seemed heavy and stagnant, as though every corner was holding its breath in anticipation of some impending calamity. My pulse throbbed uncomfortably in my neck as I walked down the narrow hallway, the single overhead bulb casting long, crooked shadows on the walls. There was no warmth left in my home, no sense of refuge or safety, only a suffocating feeling that something profoundly wrong had made its nest here. Every hair on my body prickled with awareness, and I could almost taste the bitterness of dread on my tongue. I told myself it was only my imagination, fueled by the choice we'd made, but somehow I knew it was more than that. We had invited something in, and now it refused to leave. The financial strain had been relentless for months, pressing down on me like an iron vise. I could feel its grip in my chest whenever the bills piled up, whenever the phone rang with reminders. My friend, let me call him Marcus, had been suffering a similar turmoil. Both of us felt cornered, financially strangled, and desperate for a reprieve that never seemed to come through conventional means. One evening, he came to me with an idea, an old ritual he'd discovered in a half-rotted book with unrecognizable symbols and archaic instructions. He spoke of it quietly, as though ashamed to give it voice, but the notion took root in my mind. We reasoned that we had nothing to lose. At least that was the lie we told ourselves. There was a promise, hidden between the lines of that dusty text, that some unnamed entity might grant us a stroke of fortune if we just followed each step correctly. It sounded absurd even then, but desperation makes fools of the best of us. We sealed the attic door one cold, drizzling night, using planks of old wood and rusted nails. The instructions were explicit about containing the energy in one space. With only a few candles to light the cramped darkness, we drew the symbols from the book on the floor. They were jagged and intricate, resembling the shapes of contorted animals or perhaps half-decayed plants. My hands shook as I traced the lines in chalk, and I remember the flickering candlelight making the forms shift whenever I blinked, as if they were coming alive. Marcus stood at my side, breathing shallowly, eyes wide and skin glistening with sweat. We recited the guttural phrases from that ancient text, unsure of their meaning, and even less sure of their consequences. But in our desperation, we had convinced ourselves this was a small gamble compared to the crushing weight of our debts. We felt a sudden, dreadful stillness when we finished chanting. It was as if the air itself had been sucked out of the attic. The candles flickered violently, and the shadows on the walls seemed to twist into leering shapes. Then, without warning, the largest candle went out, plunging half the attic into an inky blackness. Marcus tried to speak, but all that came out was a hoarse stutter. We felt nothing specific in those first moments. No grand manifestation, no triumphant sign that money would pour into our pockets. Just an overwhelming sense that we had opened a door best left closed. Over the following days, subtle changes began creeping through my home. At first, they were almost imperceptible. A soft scratching in the walls late at night, occasionally paired with faint tapping sounds that traveled from room to room. My heart pounded every time I woke up to those noises, sweat soaking into my sheets, my breath ragged. I told myself it was only rats or squirrels in the walls, but the more I listened, the clearer it became that this was something else entirely. The sounds were too deliberate, too carefully spaced, as if something was measuring the distance between each knock. There were moments when I swore I could feel its presence standing just on the other side of the dry wall, pressing its ear close to mine. Then objects began to move. Subtly at first. A chair that I remembered leaving in the corner would be pushed up against a table. A lamp from my desk would appear in the hallway, angled as though it had been set down with purpose. Marcus insisted I was probably just forgetting where I'd placed them, but I detected the tremor in his voice whenever he tried to reassure me. He had started hearing the same noises in his own apartment, though he seemed hell-bent on keeping that fact quiet. His tired eyes, ringed with darkness, told me more than his halting words ever could. One night, as I was drifting off to a restless sleep, I sensed a chill pass through the room. It felt like winter air had forced its way inside, biting through my sheets and settling in my bones. My breath caught in my throat, and I became acutely aware of my own heartbeat pounding like a drum in my ears. Then, a rough, throaty whisper tickled the air by my ear. I froze, my muscles rigid, a cold sweat trickling down my spine. It was a sound I could only describe as a broken voice, sliding over syllables that barely made sense. I tried to snap on the lamp by my bed, but the bulb flashed once and died. The darkness felt alive, pressing against my eyelids, refusing me the comfort of illumination. I lay there paralyzed until the whisper faded and I could finally force my limbs to move. What unnerved me more than the sounds or the shifting objects was the constant sensation of being watched. I'd find myself in the kitchen, rummaging through empty cupboards for something to eat, and feel a weight pressing against my back. My skin would prickle, and my heart would hammer until I had to spin around, expecting to catch a silhouette lurking there. Sometimes I saw a fleeting shape slip around the corner, too vague to be certain, but distinct enough to know that I wasn't alone. My lips would go dry, and I'd feel this overwhelming sense of vulnerability, as though every mistake I'd ever made was laid bare under that watchful gaze. The house seemed to amplify each of my anxieties, turning them into physical manifestations that gnawed at my sanity. Marcus and I tried to speak about it a few times, though we kept our voices low, as though the walls themselves had ears. He said that he felt as if something was trailing him at work too, even in the bright fluorescent light of the office corridors. He claimed to see a shadowy form standing in the reflection of his computer screen, only for it to vanish when he turned around. Whenever he left his cubicle, he'd find random items on his desk, moved or overturned. We both were unraveling under the unrelenting stress, the burden of financial ruin paired with this new, inexplicable disturbance that offered no relief, only further torment. I began missing deadlines, losing focus on even the simplest tasks, plagued by a continuous sense of impending doom. Marcus confessed he was thinking about quitting his job entirely, but we both knew that would only tighten the noose of our monetary problems. I tried to banish it by ignoring the rituals we had done. For a time, I imagined that if I pretended none of it had happened, it might fade. But the entity, whatever it was, seemed to feed on our avoidance. The more we fled from confronting it, the stronger it became. I found scratch marks on my bedroom wall one morning, 4 parallel lines deep enough to gouge the paint and plaster. They looked vicious, like the marks of some feral beast. My stomach flipped at the sight, and I suddenly found it hard to breathe. I noticed that my reflection in the mirror behind me was trembling, face pale, dark circles under my eyes. It was impossible to dismiss what was happening. By then, both my dreams and my waking hours were consumed with the sense of being haunted. At times, I wondered if the presence was only a manifestation of my own guilt and anxiety, but the physical signs around me proved otherwise. I wanted to clean the walls, cover the symbols in the attic, remove any reminder of that night. Yet I couldn't bring myself to do it alone, and Marcus kept postponing it as well, making excuses about exhaustion or last-minute errands. Deep down, I suspect we both feared that tampering with the symbols would provoke something far worse. Perhaps it would even unleash this presence fully, granting it freedom to roam beyond the confines of my property. My home, once a place of private solace, even in times of financial trouble, became a labyrinth of dread. The hallways felt longer than they should have, each creaking floorboard amplifying my anxiety. The lights flickered at odd intervals, as if responding to the negative energy swirling in every corner. Sometimes I'd drop something, a mug, a pen, a piece of mail, and the echo of it hitting the floor would resound far louder than it had any right to. My hands would tremble uncontrollably as I stooped to pick up whatever I'd dropped, convinced that something would grab me from behind. My breath often came in short, hot bursts, and I'd feel my temples throbbing. The attic itself was off limits for a long time. Neither of us dared to open that sealed door again, but the knowledge of what lay behind it pressed into my mind. I developed a habit of staring at the ceiling, certain I could hear faint scratching or muffled voices up there. My heart would clench in response, my chest aching from tension. Sometimes I would stand beneath the attic entrance, my eyes tracing the cracks in the plaster, and feel that presence bearing down on me from above. There came a night when I heard a deep groaning sound from the attic, like a heavy piece of furniture being dragged across the floor. The nails we had used to seal the door squeaked and shuddered, and I was certain they would be ripped out of the wood. In a surge of panic, I pressed myself against my bedroom door, hands clammy and body shaking, as if that would offer any protection. I barely slept until dawn. When the pale morning light finally crept through my windows, I found the attic door still closed. But the nails were dislodged halfway, bent outward as if something had been trying to push its way into the hallway. With my mind fraying at the edges, I resolved to confront what we had done. Marcus was hesitant, almost paralyzed by the horrors that plagued him. He kept making half-hearted promises about returning to help me cleanse the attic, but each time he either vanished into his own problems or simply froze when the hour came. In that swirl of confusion and fear, I felt an eerie determination crystallize inside me. If we didn't try something, we would be forever trapped by this suffocating terror. So, late one evening, I shut off all the lights in the house except for a single flashlight and forced myself to climb the steps to the attic. The boards groaned ominously beneath my feet, and I could hear my heart drumming in my ears. Once I reached the top, I found the chalk marks on the floor exactly as we had left them, though they seemed to have darkened in color. They looked more like burns or stains than chalk now, an almost black residue that pulsed with invisible energy. The place smelled stale and cold, each breath filling my lungs with a sharp, biting chill. The flashlight's beam wavered in my trembling hand, casting erratic shadows on the low wooden beams overhead. My senses told me I was not alone. Something was there, just beyond the edges of the light, watching me with resentful curiosity. I told myself, in a near-silent internal litany, that I was here to undo what we had done. But as I stood there, the oppressive atmosphere hit me in waves, nearly buckling my knees. The flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw a tall, contorted shape in the corner of the attic, looming and angular, like a figure folded in on itself. My body reacted with paralyzing terror. Sweat poured down my back, my skin prickled, and my lungs seized up. The figure vanished in the next flicker of light, but I felt its gaze lingering. Summoning what little courage remained, I opened the old book Marcus had brought over, skimming through the pages by flashlight. The instructions for banishment were convoluted, scrawled in archaic symbols that were difficult to decipher. I tried to focus, my breath ragged, heart hammering so loud it was all I could hear. I mimicked the gestures illustrated on the brittle page, tracing inverted shapes over the symbols on the attic floor, speaking words that felt twisted in my mouth. My voice cracked, and each syllable tasted metallic and wrong. The air grew colder, as though the temperature had suddenly plummeted, and my breath fogged in the flashlight's beam. I sensed movement around me. Soft rustling, a distortion of space, as if the shadows themselves were winding tighter. A final trembling phrase left my lips, and the attic erupted in a flurry of whispers, circling me like a swarm of insects. My flashlight flickered, threatening to die. In that oppressive darkness, I felt a force push against my chest, not physically but in a way that made my mind reel, as if it was draining me of all hope. My legs threatened to give out, and for a few horrifying seconds, I believed I would vanish into the void with that presence. Then, as swiftly as it began, the swirling madness receded. The attic went still, and the temperature seemed to rise a few degrees, just enough for me to notice. My heart was still pounding like a jackhammer, but there was no immediate sense of a tangible figure lingering. It felt like something had been forced back behind the threshold, at least partially. Taking no chances, I covered the symbols with an old rug I found shoved behind some boxes. I wanted them hidden from view, even if that was only a flimsy barrier. When I descended the steps, I found Marcus waiting in the hallway, his face ashen and haunted. He told me quietly, through broken explanations, that he had heard something shrieking up there, though my own ears had registered only furious whispers. He seemed relieved that I had taken action, but also too shaken to fully process what it all meant. Neither of us believed we had banished the entity entirely. There was no sudden shower of money or miraculous end to our debts. Instead, there remained a tangible sense of being on borrowed time, as if the house itself was holding its breath for the presence's return. I still catch flickers of movement in my peripheral vision now and then, especially in dimly lit rooms. Some nights, I hear that scraping on the walls again, faint but deliberate. Yet for the most part, I can function without feeling like every second is going to end in disaster. My steps are lighter, though still cautious, and my heart doesn't race as violently when a gust of cold air drifts through the hallway. Maybe the ritual forced the entity into dormancy, or maybe it's simply waiting for a better opportunity to remind me it's still here. I don't know which possibility unnerves me more. What I do know is that my life is far from normal, and the financial struggles remain as suffocating as ever. The difference is that now, there's a darkness tied to my soul, a reminder that I once tried to bargain with forces beyond my understanding. I can't help but feel that the presence lives off the desperation Marcus and I still carry, feeding on that intangible energy whenever we despair about the future. At times, I wonder if the ultimate price is a slow decay of our sanity, a perpetual sense of dread that no amount of money could ever alleviate. No one died, and no children were harmed. Nothing so dramatic or final. But a piece of me was claimed by the ritual, no question about it. I can sense it in the dull ache behind my eyes when I wake up, in the uneasy hush that settles over the house at twilight. Even if I leave this place, I'm convinced the memory and the lingering presence will follow me, embedded in my psyche like a stubborn splinter. In the quiet, still hours of the night, I find myself listening for the slightest creak or whisper, bracing for the possibility that what we summoned has only been biding its time. And it's in those moments of silence, when everything seems calm, that my heart races the fastest, because I know that silence, too, can be the prelude to a haunting far worse than any sound. I knew something was wrong the moment I stepped back into my house. The air felt heavier, like walking through a thick, invisible fog that pressed against my skin and settled on my lungs. My chest tightened with an inexplicable sense of unease, and each inhalation tasted stale, as though the atmosphere had grown stagnant in my brief absence. Even the entryway felt darker, the light bulb overhead appearing dimmer than usual, as if refusing to illuminate the space where I stood. It was a subtle shift, but it was enough to make me pause on the threshold. The memory of that antiques market flickered in my mind, and my gaze drifted to the parcel under my arm. 2 peculiar amulets I had purchased on a whim while traveling abroad. No one greeted me when I returned, because I live alone. Yet for the first time, I felt an odd expectation for someone, or something, to be standing in the corridor. My heart thumped heavily, and I forced myself to break that hesitation by stepping forward. The floor creaked ominously, as if the house exhaled a warning. I found myself trembling for no discernible reason. Exhaustion from the trip, I told myself. Just exhaustion. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation that I'd brought back more than souvenirs from that foreign market. I placed the amulets on a shelf in my living room. They were small, each about the size of my palm, carved from a dark, lustrous material that seemed neither fully metallic nor entirely stone. Strange symbols spiraled around their surfaces, forming motifs I didn't recognize. One was shaped vaguely like a mask with hollow eye sockets. The other resembled a coiled serpent biting its own tail. Their presence demanded attention. Even at a glance, I felt drawn in, as if the shapes themselves were shifting in my peripheral vision. A faint hum lingered in the back of my skull, a subtle pulsing, as though the objects resonated with my own heartbeat. By that evening, I understood that my initial sense of dread was not just paranoia. Small misfortunes began piling up from the moment I set the amulets down. The overhead light in the living room flickered sporadically, then dimmed for a moment before returning to full brightness. The power in that room had never been unreliable before. Several items fell from the shelves for no apparent reason. Picture frames, a decorative vase, even a simple book that had been stable moments earlier. Each time I heard the thud or crash, my heart skipped a beat, and an irrational panic took hold. I tried to brush it off, but there was no denying an unmistakable heaviness in the room. It was as though the air itself had turned malevolent, pressing in on me with each passing hour. Around 9 o'clock, the antique grandfather clock on the wall abruptly stopped. The second hand jammed, frozen at precisely 5 minutes past the hour, and the steady ticking I had grown so used to over the years fell into dead silence. My stomach nodded in response. I bent down to inspect the clock, turned the key in its mechanism, tried to wind it again, but nothing worked. The silence of that inert clock seemed more significant than a mere malfunction. It felt like a signal, a threshold crossed. A few hours later, when I tried to sleep, I heard faint sounds echoing from downstairs. At first, I thought it was a draft moving through the corridors, but the noise grew more distinct. A soft, muffled laughter, like distant chuckling behind a sealed door. My body tensed. I pressed my ear against the bedroom floorboards, holding my breath. The laughter was real, but I was alone. That sensation of isolation made my skin prickle. I spent the rest of the night awake, every muscle taut, my mind spinning with questions. Occasionally I thought I heard whispering. Other times it was just an abrupt hush, a void of sound that felt louder than noise. When daylight came, the tension eased but did not vanish. I ventured into the living room to check the amulets. They were right where I had left them, yet they looked different. Something about the surface seemed more reflective. When I glanced in their direction, I could have sworn I saw my own reflection staring back, warped and distorted like a twisted grin. I blinked, and the image vanished, leaving me with a pounding heart and clammy hands. A wave of uneasiness churned in my gut. I told myself it was the angle of the morning sun, a play of light. Still, the logic felt hollow. Over the next few days, my nerves frayed under a constant barrage of unsettling incidents. The living room lamp would turn itself off while I was reading. The water pipes groaned incessantly at odd hours, producing squeals that resembled human sighs. And then there were the footsteps, soft, deliberate steps in the attic or ceiling space, pacing above my head in the dead of night. Each time I tried to investigate, flashlight in hand, I found no one and nothing. Just empty darkness and dusty floorboards. Yet the sound would resume the moment I descended. With each repeated occurrence, the knot in my stomach tightened, as if my body recognized a predator stalking me from unseen corners. Unable to ignore the mounting dread, I decided to isolate the amulets. Perhaps they were setting me on edge. Logic insisted they were harmless objects, but my instincts screamed otherwise. I didn't want them in my living room any longer. Every glance in their direction made me queasy. I tried to recall the face of the vendor who sold them to me, a gaunt figure with deep-set eyes, but the memory was cloudy. I did recall a distinct sense of relief in the vendor's expression when I agreed to buy them, as though he couldn't wait to hand them over. That recollection alone made my heart flutter uneasily, so I placed them in a small wooden box, sealed it shut, and took it to the basement. My basement is cramped and damp, the kind of space where every echo lingers too long. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead, casting a sickly, flickering glow. I tucked the box onto a shelf in a dusty corner behind old paint cans and holiday decorations I never use. Standing there, I felt the pressure of my own pulse in my ears. My mouth had gone dry, and a fine layer of sweat covered my forehead. It was as if I was performing some forbidden act. My entire body tingled with anxiety until I set foot on the basement stairs to leave. I expected relief once the amulets were out of sight. But that night, I lay awake listening to new, more aggressive knocks reverberating through the walls. The tension in my body soared until my temples pulsed and my breathing grew ragged. Sometime past midnight, a door on the main floor slammed shut with a deafening crack, making me jump out of bed in terror. My skin crawled with the certainty that someone, or something, was inside my home. I crept into the hallway, every nerve on edge. My body felt weak, as if blood had drained from my limbs. The silence again was overwhelming, but I couldn't shake the impression of being watched from behind. Each time I turned, I saw only the empty corridor. The mental toll of these nights eroded my sanity. My eyes twitched from lack of sleep, and I found myself perpetually sweating, even though the thermostat was set low. Sometimes, in the corner of my vision, I'd see a flicker of a silhouette, a shape that vanished the moment I focused on it. I started questioning what was real and what was merely the byproduct of my exhaustion and frayed nerves. Yet each new jolt, a random bang, a flickering light, A creak that sounded like a breath reminded me this was not mere hallucination. I grew more reclusive. Friends called, asking how the trip went, and I offered only vague responses, careful not to reveal the creeping paranoia unraveling my everyday life. Once, a neighbor dropped by to see if everything was all right, because he'd heard strange noises at night. My voice shook as I assured him that I was doing some late-night cleaning, and the clatters must have carried through the walls. Inside, my heart pounded with the fear that whatever presence lurked in my house would reveal itself. I noticed that I was trembling so badly my hand left sweaty prints on the doorknob. On one particularly harrowing night, the electricity in the entire house cut out just as I was ascending the stairs to my bedroom. I froze, plunged into perfect darkness. My heart hammered so forcefully I felt it in my throat, and sweat trickled down my back. I strained my ears, and sure enough, footsteps, or something akin to footsteps, moved around below. Then came a faint scraping, like nails dragging across the walls. My breathing sped up in short, shallow bursts, and I realized I was shaking uncontrollably. For a brief instant, a wave of dizziness washed over me, and I feared I might faint. The lights flickered back on after several endless minutes. I found scratches in the wallpaper downstairs, thin, jagged lines that ran horizontally along the corridor. My blood turned cold. I had no pets, and I knew I hadn't made those marks. Still, I resisted going into the basement to check the amulets. I wanted to pretend I hadn't brought any malevolent force into my home. But the signs were everywhere. My rational mind insisted I was experiencing a prolonged psychosis brought on by stress, but a deeper part of me knew something else was at play, something that pulsed with an invisible menace. Within a few more days of this torment, I reached my breaking point. I could hardly eat. My appetite had vanished under the constant weight of dread. My face was drawn, dark circles etched under my eyes. My reflection in the mirror looked haunted, unwell. Shadows clung to my features, and the lines around my mouth seemed deeper. The anxiety perched on my chest felt like a living entity, tightening its grip by the hour. I decided I couldn't simply ignore the amulets in the basement anymore. I needed them out of my life altogether. The notion of discarding them in the trash felt insufficient, as if they would find their way back. The mental image of rummagers stumbling upon them made me shudder. On the final day, just before dusk, I retrieved the wooden box. My steps down to the basement were measured, braced for any unexpected noise or movement in the shadows. When I picked up the box, it was unnaturally cold. A chill seeped into my hands despite the stale, warm air. A dizzy spell hit me, and I leaned against the basement wall, swallowing hard against a surge of nausea. Even through the wood, I swore I sensed a faint vibration, like a heartbeat not my own. My chest constricted with terror, and a primal urgency urged me to rid myself of those cursed objects once and for all. I drove to a remote patch of land miles away from my house, a place hidden by scraggly trees and wild undergrowth. The entire journey, my knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and my thoughts raced between doubt and resolve. The road stretched on without any other cars. The later it got, the gloomier the sky became, and I felt as though night would swallow me if I hesitated. When I finally parked, darkness had fallen completely. The only light came from the pale glimmer of the moon behind thin clouds. I grabbed a small shovel from the trunk, the box clutched tightly in my other hand. My breathing rasped with each step into the brush, and the distant hooting of an owl made my skin crawl. A single drop of sweat slid down my temple as I knelt on the damp earth. I dug into the soil with frantic urgency, flinging cold dirt aside until I created a hole big enough to fit the box. My heart hammered as if trying to escape my chest. I cursed under my breath, feeling that nauseating dread bubble up again. With one final look at the sealed wooden box, I dropped it into the ground and covered it with soil. My hands shook and I felt a strange pang in my chest, an odd mixture of triumph and intense fear, as though I expected the earth to reject it. Once the hole was filled, I pressed down on the dirt and whispered a small, desperate plea for peace, for finality. My voice trembled in the night air. Then I turned on my heel, refusing to look back. Driving home, I wondered if it was truly over. My mind replayed the last few weeks, searching for any clue that something would remain tethered to me. Yet by the time I reached my front door, the air felt different, lighter, more neutral. My shoulders relaxed slightly, a sensation I hadn't experienced in days. I stepped inside, half expecting to see lights flicker or hear the telltale knocks and laughter. But it was calm, eerily calm. The silence was merely silence. My throat felt parched as I swallowed the sudden wave of relief. For the next few nights I slept with the lights on. I still jumped at every minor noise, an old pipe creaking or the wind brushing tree branches against the siding. My heart lurched a few times when I caught my reflection in a window and thought I saw something behind me, only to realize it was a trick of the light. Over time, however, the dread receded to the edges of my consciousness. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and my house felt like mine again. I still don't know what truly happened or what power those amulets carried. Part of me insists it was psychological, that I fell victim to superstition and anxiety. But another part, the one that felt that throbbing energy in the wooden box, remains unconvinced. To this day, whenever I think about that portion of my life, a chill wraps itself around my spine. Even now, I occasionally startle awake from nightmares of muted laughter and unseen eyes gazing at me through reflective surfaces. I sometimes catch myself glancing at clocks, half expecting them to stop at that same cursed hour. I don't plan on revisiting the burial site. The notion alone makes my stomach clench. I have no desire to challenge whatever presence I may have banished. I just hope the distance is enough to keep it from returning. The memory of those footsteps overhead still echoes in my mind, and there are moments when I stand in my living room, tense, ears straining in anticipation of something that is no longer there. Yet a part of me fears that the amulets are not truly gone, that perhaps burying them was only a temporary solution, like slamming a door that can still be unlocked from the other side. Even now, whenever the wind gusts late at night, or the house settles with a groan, I feel my pulse spike, and I recall that fleeting sensation of a presence just behind my shoulder. My neck hairs rise, and my palms grow clammy with remembered terror. The house may be quiet again, but something deep in my chest tells me I'm only one breath away from hearing that slow, mocking laughter in the darkness. And every time I glance at a reflective surface, I brace myself, half afraid I might see those same distorted shadows staring back at me, eager to be invited home once more. I first sensed it before I actually saw it. The air in my office felt stifling, as though something oppressive was testing the boundaries of my comfort. A subtle disquiet hummed at the edge of my consciousness, a low throb in my temples, warning me that I was no longer alone, even though the room was empty. That was how it started. An almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere, too delicate to name, but too unsettling to dismiss. I could barely articulate what I felt, but I knew something was off. Something that made my skin prickle and my breath catch. By the time my friend offered me the clown statue, I was already on edge, teetering at the threshold between the familiar and the nightmarish. I'm a straightforward man. At least I've always considered myself to be. I work in a field that relies on logic, numbers, data, clear-cut answers. I've never been given to superstitions, ghost stories, or even idle fear of the dark. It seemed foolish to me that someone would jump at a flickering light bulb or be unnerved by a strange figurine. That was before. Now, my heart races at the memory of that statue, and my palms still break out in a cold sweat whenever I recall the twisted grin and hollow eyes that haunted me day after day. My friend, an acquaintance from a trade event, insisted that the piece was a unique ceramic clown sculpture, something he thought I'd appreciate for its quirky charm. I recall he mentioned how it might brighten my office, giving it an eccentric flair. In an offhand remark, he'd even joked that it might be a conversation starter for clients, a silly, harmless object. At the time, I was too tired to question his motives or the piece's provenance. It arrived at my office the following Monday, wrapped in a soft cloth. When I unwrapped it, I immediately noticed the face. The clown's features were exaggerated. Arched eyebrows, heavy eyelids, an impossibly wide grin. But something in that grin felt wrong, like the expression wasn't one of joy, but of mockery. Its eyes, which were merely hollows in the ceramic glaze, seemed to gaze right through me. I brushed off my unease as imagination and placed the statue on a bookshelf, though it felt odd to have it observing me from up there. For the rest of that day, I tried to focus on my tasks, ignoring the peculiar impulse to glance at the clown every few minutes. I told myself it was only natural to notice a new object in my periphery. It wasn't menacing, just unfamiliar. My posture remained tense, though, as if my muscles braced for something. Deep down, part of me felt that I was being watched. By the time I headed home, the subtle tension behind my eyes had blossomed into a full-fledged headache. The next few days passed with small but noticeable disruptions in my routine. Papers went missing from my desk, only to reappear in odd places, like on top of a filing cabinet I hardly ever opened. Sometimes, I'd hear a faint tapping sound near the bookshelf. When I went to investigate, I always found the clown statue exactly where I'd left it, its posture unchanged. The rational side of me insisted that random tapping was not unusual in old buildings. Pipes, the settling of walls, the HVAC system all make strange noises. Yet something about the timing of those knocks made my pulse quicken. On the 5th day, I decided it wasn't worth the added stress to have the statue at eye level. I placed it on the floor against the far wall, as if relegating it to a position where it couldn't stare at me so directly. The moment I lifted it off the shelf, my heart thudded a little faster. The ceramic felt oddly warm to the touch, though the office was chilly that afternoon. Once I set it down, I rubbed my hands on my slacks, feeling oddly contaminated, though I couldn't explain why. It was just glazed ceramic after all. But that didn't help. If anything, it got worse. Each morning I found the clown's head angled slightly, as though its gaze followed me from the floor. There was no reason for me to think the statue had moved. I chalked it up to my memory being faulty. Perhaps I'd placed it at a tilt without realizing. Still, the suspicion gnawed at me. My chest tightened each time I looked in that direction, as though waiting for it to jerk its head or twist its lips into a genuine grin. A week later, fatigue was catching up with me. I hadn't been sleeping well, haunted by anxious dreams that dissolved into a pounding heart at 4 in the morning. I'd walk into the office each day with a throbbing behind my eyes and a metallic taste in my mouth. The statue, always in its corner, never broke its silent vigil. Sometimes the tension was too much, so I'd drape a jacket over its head, as if removing it from sight would also remove it from my mind. But that only served to make me feel more ridiculous. A grown man, cowering from a piece of ceramic. Even so, the relief was undeniable when I couldn't see that eerie grin. The tipping point came late one evening. I was returning from a long day of appointments and decided to stop by the office to drop off some documents. The corridor was dark except for the emergency light casting a yellowish glow on the far wall. My footsteps echoed in that unsettling hush, each one sounding like it belonged to someone else. I remember feeling an uneasy flutter in my stomach, the kind you get before stepping onto a stage, or into a place you know you shouldn't be. Inside my office, the overhead light flickered for a split second. My heart lurched, and I froze in the doorway. The clown statue was on the floor, right where it should have been, but I could have sworn I saw its arm move, as though it was lifting its hand to wave. The flicker was brief, but my mind held on to the image, replaying it, reinterpreting it, each iteration more terrifying than the last. I turned on every lamp I could find, my desk lamp, the small reading light near the corner, the overhead fluorescent strips. Yet my office still seemed suffocatingly dim, as though the darkness wasn't just the absence of light but a presence in its own right, pressing in from the edges. My breathing became shallow, and I felt beads of sweat forming along my hairline. My fingertips tingled with adrenaline, and my hands shook as I set the documents on my desk. Despite the lights, the corners of the room were thick with shadows, and in one corner, the clown statue loomed, a silent observer with that same unwavering grin. I couldn't tear my eyes away. My heart pounded hard enough to hurt, and my throat went bone dry. It was the most primal fear I've ever experienced, a crawling dread that made my shoulders tighten, as though something monstrous was about to descend upon me. I tried to calm myself by looking at the statue for what it was. An inanimate object, a piece of glazed ceramic. But the memory of that slight arm movement lingered, refusing to let me dismiss it as a trick of the light. The more I stared, the more it seemed to mock me with that frozen smirk. It felt like an invitation, or a challenge. My head spun with conflicting thoughts. Was I losing my grip on reality? Had exhaustion warped my senses so thoroughly that I was hallucinating? Or was there genuinely something sinister latched onto this bizarre gift? For the next few nights, I found it impossible to stay in my office after dusk. I rearranged my schedule to ensure I left before the sun went down. Occasionally, a coworker would inquire if I was feeling ill, noticing the dark circles under my eyes and my constant need for coffee. I'd mumble excuses about migraines and exhaustion. I didn't dare mention the statue or the noises, because I knew how absurd it would sound. Even I could barely believe my own experiences, and I was living through them. Meanwhile, the tapping grew more frequent, and the statue's position seemed to shift in more obvious ways. One morning, I arrived to find the clown facing the wall, its back to the room. Another morning, it seemed to have tipped slightly forward, as though about to stand up. By then, I refused to touch it. Instead, I walked around it, giving it a wide berth. A part of me felt as though my sanity hinged on not interacting with the statue. Touching it might confirm that it had some malignant energy. If I moved it, I would be acknowledging the possibility that it was more than an inanimate object. The nights at home brought no relief. I would close my eyes and see that mocking grin, picture its chipped paint and the way the hollowness of its eyes seemed somehow alive. I would hear phantom knocks in my apartment, even though I'd never brought the statue there. I felt perpetually on edge, as though the boundary between my office and my private life had collapsed. My heart pounded whenever the phone rang or the door creaked, convinced that something from that statue had followed me home. The sweat would bead on my forehead, and my breath caught in my throat whenever I thought about returning to work in the morning. Eventually, I decided the clown had to go. My friend had gifted it to me with the best of intentions, or so I assumed, but I couldn't keep it any longer. I planned to wrap it back up and store it in the supply closet until I could find someone else to take it, or perhaps even discard it. But every time I gathered the courage to pick it up, a wave of nausea crashed over me. My heart would race uncontrollably, and I'd feel as though the walls were pressing in. The statue's presence exerted a strange force on me, like it thrived on my fear and would do anything to keep me from removing it. One late afternoon, after everyone had gone, I forced myself to face it. The hallway was dark except for a single overhead light, casting a faint glow through the open door of my office. With trembling hands, I pulled out a roll of bubble wrap from a cabinet. My muscles felt weak, and my breaths were shallow. Stepping over to the statue, I noticed a slight hairline crack across its cheek I hadn't seen before. The grin now seemed downright predatory, as if the statue sensed my intentions. I knelt, ignoring the frantic drumming of my pulse. Placing my hands on its shoulders, I tried lifting it. The ceramic was heavier than I remembered, or perhaps dread made my arms feel feeble. A draft swept through the office, rustling papers on my desk and brushing cold air against the back of my neck. I imagined I felt the statue tremble in my grip. In that moment, an overwhelming certainty took hold. If I tried to throw the statue away, it would come back. That was the thought hammering in my brain, an unshakable, irrational certainty that it had claimed its place in my life. I froze, my breath catching in my lungs. A faint scraping noise sounded behind me, like fingernails on metal. My instinct screamed to turn around, but I was paralyzed by fear, my entire body locked in place. My throat felt raw, as though I wanted to scream but couldn't. Then I heard a muffled tap-tap on the far wall. The sense of being watched hit me like a shockwave. My heart hammered so violently it felt like it might burst. Summoning what little courage I had left, I spun around to see an empty office. Nothing moved, not even the shadows. Everything looked exactly as it should, except the overhead light flickered once more. The sudden flash made me jolt, and when it steadied, I realized I was still clutching the clown statue. It was as though I'd locked myself in a standoff with this inanimate thing, unwilling to let it go, yet terrified to continue holding it. I decided right then that I wouldn't destroy it. Part of me feared that such an attempt would provoke something worse, as if it would open the floodgates to an even darker phenomenon. Instead, I drove to a storage facility on the outskirts of town that same evening. I remember the entire drive, my hands trembling on the wheel, eyes darting to the rearview mirror as though expecting to see a contorted figure in the back seat. At the storage facility, I managed to secure a small locker and place the statue inside. The walls were concrete, the lighting fluorescent and dull. My heart pounded in my ears as I turned the key to lock the unit. Even then, it felt like the clown was somehow still laughing at me from behind the metal door. I returned home, half expecting more phantom knocks or glimpses of a shape in my hallway. Yet for the first time in weeks, I slept deeply, though not peacefully. My dreams were tinged with anxiety, flickers of that grin in dark corners. But the overwhelming presence I'd felt seemed muted. I awoke with a cold sweat and a heavy heart. But at least there was some sense of distance. For the next few days, I struggled to focus on work, half dreading that the statue would reappear. It didn't, though the memory of it lingered in every creak of the floorboards and flicker of a light switch. Even now, I sometimes sense a presence in my office, as though the clown's influence persists despite its absence. The feeling isn't as overpowering as before, but there are moments when I catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye, and my heart leaps into my throat. I spin around to find only empty air, and I try to calm the surge of panic that rips through my chest. My senses remain on high alert, ready for that mocking face to emerge from the shadows. Life has returned to a kind of uneasy normalcy. I continue my work, meet with clients, and pretend everything is fine. Yet deep inside, my grip on calm is precarious. Every minor disturbance, an unexpected noise, a flickering light, instantly reminds me of that statue. I can't escape the memory of its grin or the hollow gaze that seemed to burrow into my soul. The tension coils in my gut whenever I pass by a ceramic shop or see a clown image anywhere. And there's an ever-present question that nags at the back of my mind. Did I break whatever bond that statue had on me, or did I simply lock it away somewhere, waiting? Sometimes, late at night, I picture the storage facility's corridor, dimly lit, with row upon row of identical metal doors. A single overhead bulb might flicker, revealing a slender line of shadow beneath one particular door. I imagine the statue inside, alone in the dark, grinning in eternal mockery of my fear. And even though I've locked it away, I can't shake the sense that it's still watching, still waiting, as though our story isn't truly over. My heart always pounds at that thought, and I grip my bed covers a bit tighter, reminding myself it's just an object. Yet in the pit of my stomach, something twists, an instinctual dread I can't fully control. I can't be sure if it's my own anxiety or something more. I only know that whenever I recall the faint movement of its arm, the flicker of the light, and that dreadful, hollow gaze, my breath catches in my throat. A clammy film of sweat spreads across my palms, and my mouth goes dry as I sense, once again, that malignant presence I tried to banish. I carry on, but I do so knowing that fear can linger like a stain you cannot scrub clean. I haven't revisited the storage facility, and I have no plans to. Whatever lurks in that locked unit, whether real or a manifestation of my own unraveling nerves, can stay there, far away from me. Still, I suspect that some terrors don't require physical closeness to leave their mark. That grin, that mocking expression, it lives in my memories, reminding me of how tenuous our grasp on reality truly is. And though I walk away each morning, leaving the statue behind, I still feel its silent laughter echo in my mind, reminding me that some gifts cannot be easily returned. Even now, When I close my eyes, I can still feel the weight of that old armchair looming in the corner of my mind. It was just a piece of furniture, worn and battered, yet it carried an unsettling presence that seeped into the very air I breathed. From the moment I first laid eyes on it, I knew something was wrong. There was a stale odor clinging to its fabric, as though it had absorbed the anguish of countless nights. It was the kind of smell that settles deep into your lungs and makes it hard to breathe properly, the kind that follows you even when you leave the room. I had rented a modest second-floor bedroom in a sprawling colonial house. The decision was purely practical. I needed somewhere affordable, and I was drawn to the promise of wide hallways and high ceilings. The landlord, a reserved older man, led me up a creaking staircase and motioned silently toward the door at the end of the corridor. I remembered how his expression remained neutral, but his eyes flickered with something akin to reservation. He gestured for me to examine the room, and that was when I first noticed the armchair, a grim specter hunched in the far corner. It looked out of place against the faded floral wallpaper and the threadbare rug. Its once velvet upholstery had worn down to rough patches, revealing the wooden frame beneath in some spots. On my first night, I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just a piece of furniture that had seen better days. But when I turned off the overhead light and lay in bed, I could not shake the impression that the corner was somehow darker than the rest of the room. My heartbeat thudded in my ears every time I let my gaze wander there. My chest felt tight, and the hair on my arms stood on end, as if the room's temperature had plummeted. Each time I thought about drifting off to sleep, I got a jolt of anxiety that left me cold and restless. I tried to rationalize this unease by attributing it to the stress of moving to a new place. I told myself I was experiencing only the typical nerves of sleeping in an unfamiliar room. Yet I knew there was more to it when I heard a faint creaking sound, so soft that at first I thought it was my imagination. It was barely audible, just a subtle groan like old wood under gentle pressure. My breath caught in my throat, and I strained to see in the darkness. The corner remained dim, unmoving. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I fell asleep without further incident that night. But the lingering sense of dread was like a splinter in my mind, small yet impossible to ignore. Over the next few days, I busied myself unpacking my meager belongings and settling into the space. The landlord seemed relieved that I had no complaints, though I noticed he avoided entering my room altogether. Whenever I mentioned the armchair, he nodded but offered no explanation. He did mention, indirectly, that the furniture had been there for as long as he could remember. That single remark set my thoughts spiraling. If he had owned this place for decades, then who had the armchair actually belonged to? The nights that followed grew progressively more disturbing. Each morning I woke up feeling unrested, my muscles tense and my mouth dry. I started to develop a pattern of waking at odd hours with the suffocating feeling that I was being watched. My skin would turn clammy, and a wave of nausea would rise from my stomach. That corner felt heavier in the darkness, almost alive, as if it pulsed with a heartbeat separate from my own. Whenever I mustered the courage to turn on the bedside lamp, the armchair sat empty, looking utterly lifeless. Yet I noticed the cushion was slightly indented, as though someone, or something, had just risen from it. My rational mind fought to maintain a grip on reality. I told myself it could be the draft from the old windows or the uneven floorboards that caused the chair to shift. Yet the little things piled up. The soft wheeze of breath that seemed to hover around my ears. The musty smell that intensified at night. The sensation of cold whenever I stood near the armchair. One evening, I caught myself trembling uncontrollably while brushing my teeth. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked pale, with sweat beading on my forehead. The entire time I was out of the room, I was acutely aware of that corner upstairs, as if my mind refused to let me forget for a single moment. I became almost afraid to sleep, haunted by the idea that I might wake to find someone seated in that chair, staring at me with hollow eyes. The fear settled into my muscles, making them rigid, and my chest felt perpetually tight. Even my breathing changed. I found myself taking shallow sips of air, as though I were preparing to flee at any moment. Late one night, I thought I heard a voice, faint and garbled, as though submerged underwater. The words, if there were any, were not clear, but the intonation was unmistakably hostile. My heart kicked into a frantic beat, and my fingertips went numb. I lay there, paralyzed, too petrified to reach for the lamp. My mind started racing. Was I asleep and dreaming? Had the stress finally corroded my mental stability? My skin prickled with an overwhelming sense of dread, as if I were lying inches away from something malevolent that could sense my fear. As the days passed, I started avoiding being in the room for too long. I would take my meals in the house's tiny kitchen and linger there, flipping through an old newspaper or sipping tea, just so I wouldn't have to go back upstairs too soon. The landlord mostly kept to himself. On a rare occasion, he implied that the house had its peculiarities, and that some previous tenants had not stayed for very long. He never gave explicit reasons, but his sideways glances and lowered tone spoke volumes. I asked if there was any history I should know about, but he only shrugged, mumbled something about "not sure," and left the rest unsaid. I felt a new surge of unease, as though secrets were threaded into the very walls. Within a week, my nights had become a silent battle. The fear was transforming into something akin to obsession. I would lie awake, fighting the urge to stare at the corner, listening for any slight change in the ambient noises of the house. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like footsteps. Every shift of the wind through the shutters was a ragged whisper. My mind began to play tricks on me. Once, while drifting off, I believed I saw a shadow rise from the chair and glide toward the door. My entire body jerked upright, and I scrambled to turn on the lamp, cold sweat drenching my pajamas. Nothing was there. No shadow, no footprints. But the cushion was visibly depressed, as though an invisible form had just stood. My paranoia grew to the point where I started questioning the reliability of my senses. I began writing notes to myself during the day, reminding myself to stay calm and rational. I took pictures of the chair with my phone, hoping to capture something, anything unusual. Reviewing those images only frustrated me. The corner always appeared slightly darker than the rest of the room, but there was nothing else out of the ordinary. At times, I felt like laughing at my own absurdity, but the fear was too tangible for me to dismiss it as mere imagination. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at work, I arrived at the house with a sense of raw exhaustion. My head throbbed, and my eyes burned with fatigue. I climbed the stairs with a newfound determination to confront whatever was happening. My plan was to walk into the room, stand by the armchair, and prove to myself that it was just a threadbare piece of furniture. However, as soon as I opened the door, a chill washed over me. The air inside felt stale, suffused with the faint odor of something old and rotting. My hands began to tremble. I tried to stand tall, but my heart hammered like a drum in my chest, and my breath came in short, ragged gasps. Ignoring the prickling at the back of my neck, I stepped toward the armchair. My footsteps sounded hollow on the wooden floor. Each step felt like a monumental effort, as though an invisible presence were trying to push me back. When I was close enough to touch it, I reached out a hand. The fabric felt colder than I expected, almost damp, and a burst of goosebumps crawled up my arm. Then I heard it, a rasping exhalation, so close it could have been my own breath, yet it held a resonance that felt alien. My heart skipped a beat. A wave of dizziness struck me, and I jerked my hand away as though I had touched a live wire. That night, I barely slept. Every nerve in my body was on high alert, ready to spring out of bed at the slightest provocation. Sometime after midnight, I heard a long, drawn-out creak, as if the chair were slowly rocking back and forth. I gripped the sheets so tightly my knuckles turned white. Then the unmistakable sound of breathing began, heavy, labored, filling the small room with a sinister rhythm. My eyes watered from sheer terror, and my pulse roared in my ears. I felt pinned in place, unable to call for help or even flick on the lamp. The darkness pressed in, thick and suffocating, and for a moment I was convinced I saw movement, a shape stirring in the corner. My vision blurred at the edges, and my chest constricted with such force that I thought I might pass out. Suddenly, the weight lifted. The oppressive presence diminished as if it had never been there. My body convulsed in a rush of relief, and I gasped for air. In the faint moonlight spilling through the curtains, I saw the outline of the chair. The cushion appeared distorted, as though something invisible still rested upon it. But after a few seconds, the shape settled back into emptiness. At dawn, I stumbled out of bed, my bones aching from tension, and made a decision. I could not spend another night under that same roof without seeking some kind of resolution. I went downstairs to talk to the landlord. I explained my experiences, not in detail, but enough so that he would understand I was serious. He looked at me with a mix of apprehension and guilt, eventually alluding to the fact that there had been other stories tied to that chair, that previous renters had described sensations of a hidden presence or fleeting glimpses of a figure at night. He wouldn't elaborate further, only suggesting that he had tried to get rid of the furniture once, but it ended up back in the room. Driven by adrenaline and anger, I decided to remove the chair myself. Without waiting for his approval, I hauled it down the stairs, nearly stumbling under its unexpected weight, and dragged it into the backyard. The whole time I felt like I was being watched. My hands trembled, and my breathing was shallow. The landlord emerged onto the porch, speechless, as I left the chair there in the early morning light. I remember a suffocating silence between us, weighted with the unspoken possibility that it might not be so easy to cast out whatever lingered in the old wood and fabric. That final day in the house passed in a blur. I packed my suitcase, ignoring my body's protests of fatigue. By late afternoon, I loaded my car and glanced one last time at the backyard, where the armchair stood under a crooked oak tree. My spine tingled at the sight of it. In my peripheral vision, I thought I noticed the cushion depress, as though an invisible shape had just settled in. My gut twisted in revulsion. It might have been a trick of the light, but I couldn't deny the unease that consumed me. I drove away, my hands shaking against the steering wheel, my throat tight with unresolved fear. Even as I left the old colonial house in my rearview mirror, I felt no real sense of triumph. I was relieved to escape its haunted corridors and that cursed armchair, but I couldn't help sensing something had followed me, a lingering imprint of that suffocating presence. In the days that followed, I would sometimes jerk awake at night, convinced I heard the faint creak of wood or the rasp of a distant breath. My heart would pound, and I would blink in the darkness of my new apartment, drenched in sweat. Though I knew the armchair was gone from my life, part of me wondered if it had truly let me go. That is the final horror of it all. I escaped without truly understanding the force behind the chair's existence. The not knowing, the perpetual question of whether I had really broken free, or merely given it a new place to lurk, kept my nerves on edge. Even now, whenever I enter a dimly lit room, I instinctively check the corners. I listen for that unholy creak of wood and breath. Sometimes, in the stillness, I swear I can feel it. Waiting, patient, ready to settle beside me once more. A single gust of wind swept through the narrow city streets as I arrived at the centuries-old boarding house, carrying with it a chill that crept across my skin. I paused at the threshold, gazing up at the weather-beaten facade, and felt something tighten in my chest, as though the building itself exhaled a long-held secret. The atmosphere pressed in on me with an oppressive weight, and the sun's fading light cast the carved wooden doors in sharp relief. Even before I set foot inside, I sensed a distinct unease flickering in the corners of my mind, an unspoken warning that something was out of place. Little did I know that this cautionary feeling was only the beginning of a long, sleepless weekend and a confrontation with my own sanity. I had come for a business event, a series of presentations that required me to stay in town for 2 nights. Most hotels had been booked, so I was forced to seek accommodations in this old-fashioned boarding house, rumored to have been built over a century ago. Stepping into the dim lobby, my eyes adjusted to the warm glow of antique lamps placed sporadically along the walls. The air smelled of old books and dust, a stale closeness that made me clear my throat. My gaze drifted across the hallway's decor. Portraits of stern-faced individuals in Victorian-era attire, wooden tables with elaborate claw-like legs, and porcelain figurines perched on ledges as though silently scrutinizing each visitor. The front desk itself was a relic, a massive mahogany structure with ornate carvings of gargoyles and twisting vines. Every crevice whispered of bygone days, and every shadow threatened to hide something I wasn't prepared to discover. The proprietor, an older man with a deeply lined face, quietly handed me a room key. He barely met my eyes, muttering something about how business had slowed in recent years. I sensed a latent tension in his voice, a reluctance to share more than was absolutely necessary. His movements were stiff, and I noticed the faint tremor in his fingers as he set down the heavy key on the desk. Although we exchanged only a few words, the silence between us seemed loaded, as though both of us knew there was more to be said, but had mutually agreed not to disrupt whatever eerie equilibrium existed within these walls. Clutching the key, I followed the narrow hallway to my assigned room, hearing nothing but my own hesitant footsteps and the old wooden floor's faint creaks under my weight. Upon entering the room, I was instantly struck by its antiquated elegance: deep red wallpaper, heavy curtains that blocked out most of the waning daylight, and a tall wardrobe with brass handles. The bed frame looked older than my grandparents' time, with filigree accents and an unsettling slump to the mattress. But it was the mirror that drew my attention the most. Taller than any mirror I'd ever seen, it stood on an intricately carved wooden base, its edges molded into the shapes of grimacing faces, swirling leaves, and curling serpents. My stomach churned just looking at it. The glass itself was spotted with what looked like centuries of tarnish around the edges, creating the impression of a dark halo whenever I stood before it. Despite my unease, I reassured myself that it was simply an antique curiosity. That first night, the sense of discomfort was subtle, almost ignorable. I unpacked my suitcase and set out my formal clothes for the next day, intentionally avoiding looking at the mirror for too long. Once or twice, out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw movement behind me, a faint flicker as though a shadow passed across the reflective surface. Each time my pulse quickened, and I held my breath, waiting for any obvious sign that something was there. But when I pivoted to confront whatever had caught my attention, I saw nothing but my own tired reflection. By the time I decided to lie down, my heart was pounding with a force that felt disproportionate to the stillness of the room. I tried to calm my racing thoughts by focusing on the event I had come to attend, but a lingering sense of being watched made every fiber of my body tense. That night's sleep was jagged and uneasy. I awoke more than once to faint sounds, a soft scraping perhaps, or the gentle rustle of curtains, although there was no breeze to move them. My mouth felt dry each time I turned over, forcing me to swallow hard against the tension in my throat. Shadows wavered in the corners of the room, and the silhouette of the massive mirror loomed against the far wall, acting like a silent sentinel. Even with my eyes closed, I sensed the mirror's presence, as though it exuded a subtle pulse that made my skin crawl. By morning, I was exhausted, shoulders stiff, temples throbbing from clenching my jaw. Yet I brushed it off, telling myself it was just a reaction to the unfamiliar environment and a notoriously restless mind. The following day, after returning from the first round of event presentations, I noticed my apprehension mounting as I climbed the creaking stairs to the second floor. The hallway stretched before me, lit by wall sconces that cast flickering light across aged wallpaper. My hand was clammy on the banister. At my door, I paused, key halfway to the lock, and listened for a moment. My ears caught a faint tapping, like fingernails against wood. It came from inside the room. My nerves flared, and I felt my pulse hammer in my wrists. I hesitated to enter, considering the possibility of someone rummaging around, but the noise subsided almost instantly. When I finally worked up the nerve to push open the door, I found nothing out of place. Yet the hair on the back of my neck stood on end, as if a charge of electricity danced through the air. That evening, I tried to distract myself by perusing the old books that had been piled in a corner cabinet. They were mostly archaic texts on local history, a few collections of Gothic poetry, and some religious tracts with pages so brittle I feared they might crumble in my hands. My attempts at distraction worked for a brief while, until a sudden creak made me turn sharply. It was the mirror again. The wood around the frame groaned, as if pressure was being applied from the inside. I couldn't stop myself from staring at its intricate carvings. In the shifting glow of the antique lamp, each carved face appeared more grotesque, their expressions twisting into silent grimaces. My breathing grew ragged, and a cold sweat formed on my forehead. An icy shiver locked my spine in place, yet I forced myself to stand and approach the mirror. As I inched closer, the surface of the glass seemed to ripple, almost imperceptibly, as though something behind it was pushing forward. I leaned in, my reflection unsteady in the dim light. The tension in my stomach twisted into a knot, and my heart thudded like a relentless drum. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure that wasn't me, a shape so unclear that my eyes darted around the frame to locate it. But as soon as I blinked, I found only my own pale face staring back, pupils dilated and lips set in a grim line. I felt an undeniable sense of intrusion, like I was trespassing on someone else's domain. When I finally broke away from the mirror's pull, my hands trembled to the point where I had trouble steadying my breath. I kept telling myself it was all in my head. Exhaustion, old house noises, psychological tension from the event. Trying to calm my nerves, I turned off the lamp and crawled under the musty covers. The darkness felt heavier than usual, as though the gloom of the room pressed down on my chest. Every time I neared the edge of sleep, a soft creak or whisper jolted me awake, hard in my throat. Around 3 a.m, I jolted upright, soaked in sweat, certain I had heard a long, low groan. Sitting in the pitch-black room, I was painfully aware of the mirror's presence. My eyes, searching desperately for any trace of movement, landed on the faint outline of its reflection in the moonlight. And then it came again, another agonized squeal from the wood, like the slow twist of a doorknob on rusted hinges. I choked out a silent gasp, goosebumps erupting on my arms. I realized that the sound was coming from the mirror's frame, as though it were being compressed by invisible hands. Unable to control my fear, I threw back the covers and stood, every muscle poised for flight. My head felt light, and I had to steady myself against the wall to keep from reeling. A feverish wave of adrenaline coursed through my body, making my vision blur at the edges. Summoning every ounce of courage, I edged closer to the mirror, my bare feet tingling against the cold floor. With each step, my heartbeat thrummed so loudly that I couldn't hear anything else. Then, in the glass, I saw it. A ripple followed by a faint silhouette, a shape that moved inhumanly slow, and yet commanded my attention with horrifying clarity. It pressed against the inside of the mirror, causing the surface to bulge outward, then recede like a membrane. I let out a trembling exhale, tears prickling at the corners of my eyes from sheer terror. I can't say how long I stood there, locked in place, watching that ghastly shape flicker in and out of view. Eventually, my mind went blank with panic, and I staggered back, fumbling for the light switch. The moment the soft lamp glow flooded the room, the mirror's surface stilled. No shape remained, just my reflection staring back at me, as if mocking my horror. My breath came in short, sharp bursts, each inhale tight with fear. Clutching my aching chest, I spent the rest of that night wide awake, resting in a stiff-backed chair as far from the mirror as possible. When morning finally broke, I felt a desperate need to escape the oppressive air. I stepped into the hallway, bleary-eyed and jumpy at every sound. The proprietor appeared, noticing the fear etched on my face. He asked in a halting tone if I'd experienced anything unusual. Rather than give a coherent explanation, I simply said I hadn't slept well. He mentioned in a reluctant manner that other guests had reported unsettling phenomena in that same room, mostly centering around the mirror. At this, a fresh wave of dread swept through me. My stomach churned, and cold sweat dotted my forehead. The thought that my experiences were not isolated made my hands tremble anew. Though I was supposed to remain one more night, I felt an overpowering urge to leave immediately. However, my professional obligations required me to attend one final part of the event, so I resolved to check out as soon as it ended. All day long, I was distracted, scarcely able to focus on the presentations. My mind kept wandering back to the mirror. I replayed the horrifying images over and over, questioning my sanity. Was it a trick of the light? A manifestation of sleep deprivation? Or perhaps something far darker that the rational mind struggles to accept? By the time I returned to the boarding house that evening, my entire body was tense, and a persistent headache throbbed at my temples. The corridor seemed darker than before, and my skin prickled as if unseen eyes followed my every movement. Even the doorknob to my room felt cold against my palm, sending a jolt of apprehension straight through me. Inside, the mirror stood where it always had, a silent monolith reflecting the gloom back at me. My dread had become a near paralyzing terror, but I couldn't look away from it. Something about that reflective surface drew me in, as though daring me to confront it one last time. My plan was simple: gather my belongings and leave. I moved carefully around the perimeter of the room, avoiding the mirror's reflection. Each item I shoved into my suitcase felt like an urgent step toward sanity. My heart hammered with every creak of the floorboards. At one point, the overhead light flickered, plunging me into near darkness for a split second. In that moment, I caught sight of a shifting contour in the mirror, a distortion that warped my reflection into something monstrous. My knees threatened to give way, and I cursed under my breath, forcing myself to finish packing as fast as I could. At last, I zipped my suitcase, refusing to glance at the mirror again. But as I turned for the door, I heard that same groan of the frame, the wooden straining that had haunted me for 2 nights. It was louder, almost anguished. Against my better judgment, I pivoted to face it. The reflection was bending, the glass swirling like liquid, and a faint outline of that unearthly silhouette began to emerge again. This time, I sensed its pull, as if it yearned for me to step closer. My entire body broke out in goosebumps, and a wave of nausea hit me so violently that I nearly doubled over. I gritted my teeth, willing myself to maintain control. My heart hammered erratically, and tears of raw fear blurred my vision. It took every ounce of willpower to fight the compulsion to approach the mirror. With a surge of adrenaline, I rushed out of the room, stumbling into the corridor. My suitcase banged against the walls as I bolted for the stairs. The entire house seemed to vibrate with a menacing energy, the old floorboards groaning as though they might collapse. My breath came in ragged gasps, face hot despite the chill that clung to my skin. I dashed by the front desk, half expecting the proprietor to ask what was wrong, but he only watched me with a knowing, haunted look. It felt as if he'd witnessed the same bizarre manifestations countless times before, and was resigned to the fact that nothing could be done about it. Once I burst through the front doors and inhaled the cool night air, my body began to shake uncontrollably. Relief mingled with the residue of overpowering dread. Part of me feared that the reflection I had seen wasn't just confined to that mirror. What if I caught a glimpse of it in a shop window or the side view mirror of my car? The notion sent another wave of panic through me, as if the entity, or presence, had attached itself to my consciousness. My breathing sounded unnaturally loud to my own ears, and even the passing headlights of cars made me flinch. I couldn't rid myself of the suffocating sense that I was being followed. Finally, with trembling hands, I managed to hail a taxi. As it pulled away from the curb, I looked back at the boarding house's worn facade. In the upper window, a faint light flickered, and I thought, though it may have been a trick of my nerves, that I saw something shift behind the glass. My heart clenched in response. I leaned back against the seat, eyes burning, letting exhaustion seep into my bones. That mirror, with its carved faces and unnatural reflections, would stay with me forever. Even as I tried to steady my breath, flashes of the distorted image replayed in my mind, making my stomach twist. In the days that followed, I found myself checking mirrors with caution, always half expecting to see that shape lurking behind me. The rational part of my brain insisted it was merely a product of sleep deprivation, an overactive imagination sparked by a series of uncanny noises in an ancient building. But the memory of that warping glass, of the silhouette that moved without any regard for my comprehension of reality, refused to vanish. Sometimes, I wake in the middle of the night, convinced I hear that same agonized groan of wood, echoing through my mind. I break out in cold sweat, my skin prickling with dread, and I can almost feel the same oppressive presence as if it never truly left. No one else truly understands the terror that gripped me in those moments, nor the sense of unreality that continues to shadow my everyday life. Mirrors have become my enemy. I keep them covered or tucked away, unwilling to relive the horror of confronting a presence that seems to exist just beneath the surface. Even so, the memory persists, forcing me to question whether my escape was complete, or if part of me remains trapped on the other side of that reflection. Now, every gleam of a reflective surface is a reminder that the boundary between our world and whatever lies beyond might be far thinner than I'd ever believed. And so I carry that experience with me, unable to discard it like some nightmare easily forgotten by dawn. I survived the old boarding house, but a fragment of it haunts my waking hours. Whenever I sense a flicker of movement in a mirror, or a distant creak that seems to come from nowhere, I can't help but feel my heart skip a beat. There are moments I wonder if something from that place still watches me, waiting for a moment of weakness. And I realize with chilling certainty that I have no proof otherwise. Sometimes, surviving is not the same as escaping. The reflection that was not mine remains a phantom echo in every polished surface, a permanent reminder that there are places we're never meant to peer into for too long, and things on the other side that might just peer back. Darkness clung to the concrete walls like a silent predator, and even before I reached the elevator doors, I felt a low, throbbing pulse of unease at the base of my skull. It was the sort of moment in which every footstep sounds too loud, echoing through a hollow space that seems endless. The kind of moment where the simple act of pressing a button can trigger a cascade of dread. I told myself it was just another late evening, just another routine visit to the office. But the crisp chill in the subterranean air felt wrong, as though an unseen presence lurked in the shadows. I had parked on the third sublevel, S3 of the building many times before, especially when the surface lot was full. It wasn't pleasant. Most subterranean parking decks weren't. But tonight it felt even more oppressive than usual. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed and flickered, painting the rows of vehicles in a sickly, shifting glow. My sneakers squeaked against the cold cement floor with every tentative step I took toward the elevator. The echo of that squeak came back at me, distant yet strangely delayed, as if the structure itself were breathing in time with my movements. I pressed the button for the elevator, fully expecting the typical mechanical whine that signaled the lift's approach. Instead, I heard only a hollow click. Several seconds passed in absolute silence before the faint hum and a dull thump announced the elevator's arrival. The doors slid open with a drawn-out scrape, revealing an empty, dimly lit car. Despite a sudden urge to hesitate, I forced myself to step inside, inhaling the stale, metallic scent that always accompanied old elevators. When I selected the button for S3, I stood back and waited, keeping an uneasy watch on the floor indicator above the door. The numbers began to descend, passing G, ground, S1, S2, then S3. My stomach tightened when the elevator shuddered to a stop, and the doors parted with a labored groan. Rather than opening onto the third sublevel, I found myself staring at what appeared to be the exact same lobby from which I had just come. The same dull sheen on the floors, the same discolored tile near the corner. It was impossible because I knew I had already left that floor. Yet here it was, in front of my eyes. My chest constricted in panic, and my breathing sped up. I could taste a metallic tang at the back of my throat as my heart hammered. There was a single security guard leaning against the reception desk. He wore the standard Navy uniform and cap, a radio clipped to his belt, and he kept his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the far wall. I realized something was off almost immediately. His movements, if they could be called that, were unnaturally slow. I tried to ask him what was going on, but he didn't react in any normal way. Instead, his body twitched as though he heard something, but he remained turned away. I stepped closer, only to notice that his figure seemed translucent at the edges, like an image projected onto a rippling surface. An icy jolt of adrenaline coursed through me. My hands felt clammy and my face flushed with heat. It was as if my brain refused to comprehend the scene. I tried to speak again, attempting to get his attention. My own voice sounded foreign and muffled in the stale air. He made a minimal effort to turn, but his outline wavered like a reflection in disturbed water. I couldn't see his face clearly, only the vague shape of his jaw and the slope of his nose. A dread deeper than anything I'd felt in years flooded me, causing beads of sweat to form along my temples and down my neck. Fighting a mounting sense of nausea, I stumbled back into the elevator, nearly colliding with the steel wall. My skin prickled, and the hair on my arms stood on end. I reached out with trembling fingers to press the button marked G for ground. The door slid shut with an almost resentful hiss. I tried to steady my breathing, reminding myself to stay calm. For a few tense moments, I could hear the elevator cables groaning as the car ascended. My eyes flicked incessantly to the floor indicator, watching it tick upward. S2, S1, G. When the doors opened this time, the stale air was gone. I was greeted by the brightly lit ground floor lobby. Everything seemed normal. Regular foot traffic, the usual hum of distant chatter from the reception area. My relief was immediate, and my legs almost gave way. I saw a different security guard at the main desk, one I recognized from several visits. He moved in a natural way, responding to someone's question, nodding politely. I didn't try to talk to him just yet. I needed a moment to gather myself and consider what I'd just witnessed. I found a bench in the lobby and sat for a couple of minutes, rubbing my sweaty palms against my jeans, trying to quell the trembling in my arms. My mind raced. Was it some sort of malfunction with the elevator, or had I dozed off somehow? But how to explain the guard's spectral appearance? I recalled that I had pressed S3, watched the numbers descend, and yet arrived where I had started. The memory was too vivid, too concrete to dismiss as a trick of the mind. The humidity in the subterranean levels could mess with a person's senses, but it never forced me to hallucinate so strongly. Eventually, I decided that I couldn't just abandon my car in the depths of the parking deck. My entire body tensed as I walked back toward the elevator bank, fully expecting to meet some bizarre distortion again. But I was determined. I needed to see if the phenomenon would repeat itself. I pressed the button for another elevator, taking care to choose a different car from the one I had used previously. The door opened smoothly, and I stepped inside, trying to ignore how my heart thrummed against my ribs. The ride down felt excruciatingly slow. I watched the indicator. B1, the label for the first basement level in this building, although it was sometimes called S1. B2, B3. The numbers glowed in sequence. My pulse quickened at B3, the final stop. The car's motion ceased with a gentle jolt, and the doors opened. This time, the corridor looked right for B3, a long, dull hallway with exposed pipes running overhead. A sign pointed to the parking area. The environment still felt oppressive, the temperature dropping the moment I stepped out. At least it looked normal enough to set me marginally at ease. I followed the corridor to the parking lot. Dim overhead lights illuminated rows of pillars, each spaced evenly, dividing the structure into sections. The stale scent of motor oil mixed with the faint odor of damp concrete. My shoes echoed sharply, and I couldn't shake the impression that something else was tapping along in sync behind me. Every time I paused, the echo took an extra second to stop, as though it continued briefly on its own. My stomach twisted in knots, and I fought to keep my breathing steady. I scanned the lot for my vehicle. The arrangement of cars seemed more scattered than I remembered. Many were parked crookedly, some overlapping painted lines. As I ventured deeper, the lights flickered more intensely. Several times they dimmed enough to plunge entire rows into near darkness, only to flare back up seconds later. Each flicker heightened my anxiety, giving me the sense that I was intruding in a space that didn't welcome human presence. I spotted my car at the far end, near a tall concrete wall. A surge of relief coursed through me at the sight of its familiar shape. I fumbled in my pocket for the key fob, pressing the button to unlock the doors. The headlights flashed, momentarily making everything around me look warped in the sudden burst of illumination. I hurried across the cement floor, my footsteps echoing in unsteady rhythm. That sense of being watched magnified. I felt a crawling sensation at the back of my neck, as though unseen eyes were tracing every movement. Then I heard the whisper. At least, I thought I heard it. A barely discernible sound that might have been air moving through vents, but something in its quality was too deliberate, too human-like. It carried no words that I could understand, but it radiated a strange urgency. My skin prickled and my breath caught in my throat. I scanned the area, desperate to pinpoint any sign of a person or even a glitchy PA system. There was no one. The only security camera I noticed was mounted high on a pillar, its red light blinking indifferently. I forced myself to move faster. My legs felt stiff, as if I were wading through an invisible current resisting every step. I finally reached my car, yanked the door open, and slid into the driver's seat. The overhead interior light cast a weak glow on the steering wheel. I locked the doors immediately, hands trembling on the latch. My heart was pounding so violently that I could feel it in my temples. I started the engine, hearing the comforting hum of the motor as it turned over. I reversed out of the spot, the headlights sweeping across the pillars and revealing fleeting shapes in the corners of my vision. Each shape dissolved the moment I tried to focus on it, leaving only more gray concrete. My nerves were on a razor's edge. I navigated the twisting ramps upward, scanning for the exit signs that would lead me back to the ground floor. The route seemed longer than usual, as though the structure had warped itself into an unending maze. By the time I finally reached the ticket booth at the exit, my chest felt tight with the strain of near hyperventilation. The booth was unmanned at this hour, but the barrier lifted automatically when I inserted my validated ticket. I pulled onto the city street, where the fluorescent glow of streetlights and the presence of passing cars felt comforting, almost serene. Yet my body was still buzzing with tension. My pulse refused to settle. I had to coax myself to park on a nearby side street just to catch my breath. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, staring into the rearview mirror, half expecting to glimpse a translucent figure looming in the back. But nothing appeared. I tried to rationalize what I'd experienced, running through every logical explanation. Perhaps the elevator had malfunctioned, or I had briefly lost consciousness. Hallucinations can occur under extreme stress, but I'd never had such a potent one. And that security guard, his partial transparency, the surreal lag in his movements, didn't feel like a mere trick of the eyes. The entire environment had shifted in a way that defied normal experience. In an effort to regain control, I decided to return to the lobby once more the following day, during normal business hours, when everything was bright and bustling. Morning sunshine streamed through the glass doors, and the smell of fresh coffee from a small cafe in the corner filled the air. I asked the daytime security guard if there had been any nighttime staff changes recently. He casually replied that only the usual team was on rotation. He mentioned one guard who occasionally worked night shifts, a man older than the others, who had been employed for many years. The guard added, with an offhand laugh, that some people joked the man had been there forever, almost like part of the building. I felt a prickle at the back of my neck, but tried not to show my unease. I didn't mention the surreal event from the previous night. Instead, I took an elevator ride down to the parking levels, trying to gather concrete proof that everything was normal. The signage was the same, the corridors bleak but consistent with what I remembered. My car was still in the same general area I'd left it that morning. Nothing looked out of place, and I found no sign of a translucent figure. I walked the perimeter of the level, stepping cautiously, listening for any disembodied whispers or echoing footsteps. All I heard was the faint hum of ventilation units. The day passed without incident, and for a fleeting moment, I convinced myself that the prior night had been some elaborate product of an exhausted mind. Perhaps I had conflated a real security guard silhouette with swirling dust motes in my peripheral vision. That was the rational side of me, desperately seeking a normal explanation. Yet a subconscious voice insisted it had been real. Every nerve in my body had screamed in terror, and that sensation doesn't simply emerge from nowhere. Over the next week, each evening, I found excuses not to venture into the subterranean levels after dark. I would park on the street whenever possible. If forced to use the basement parking, I'd choose the upper levels only. However, curiosity gnawed at me, urging me to test the boundaries of that experience. Paranoia crept into my everyday life. I caught myself glancing over my shoulder in brightly lit corridors, jumping at the slightest sound of air pressure shifting in the building's ventilation. My sleeping patterns deteriorated. Nightmares flared up where I relived the moment the elevator doors opened to reveal that impossibly identical lobby. Each time I jerked awake, drenched in sweat, my heart rattling like it sought to burst free of my chest. Eventually, I summoned the nerve to talk to the building maintenance supervisor. I couched my inquiries in practical terms, asking if the elevator had a history of glitches. He shrugged, remarking that some of the older cables were scheduled for replacement, and there had been sporadic issues with misalignment. He claimed it sometimes caused the floor indicator to skip or repeat, but nothing he said accounted for the ghostly security guard. He did mention, in a slightly hushed voice, that the basement levels felt off to a number of people, but nobody had ever complained about seeing a phantom. My final attempt at confronting this phenomenon happened a few nights later. I deliberately worked late and headed down around the same time as before. The fluorescent lights still buzzed, casting jittery shadows on the cement. My pulse spiked the moment I approached the elevator, but I forced myself to continue. Every fiber of my being screamed to turn back, but I stepped in, pressed the button for S3, and waited. The car descended, G, B1, B2, B3. When the doors opened, it was the correct sublevel, rows of cars dimly visible. Relief washed over me, but I stayed put. I pressed the button for S1, then S2, then S3 again, cycling through each level, attempting to coax the elevator into reproducing the terrifying glitch. The doors opened onto the correct floors each time. My heart rate slowed, and I felt almost triumphant in my relief. On my final trip back to the ground floor, as I passed B2, the elevator shuddered more violently than usual. For a split second, the overhead light flickered, and I glimpsed a reflection in the polished metal door, the shape of a man in a navy uniform standing behind me. My breath caught, and before I could spin around, the elevator light returned. I stood alone. My stomach plummeted, and cold sweat trickled down my spine. I nearly dropped my keys as I fumbled to exit on the ground floor. When I emerged into the lobby, everything was as ordinary as always. Bright lights, mild chatter, the faint whir of the AC system. The security guard on duty was a young man I recognized, flipping through a clipboard. I forced myself to walk calmly past him, though my skin was crawling with dread. Stepping onto the sidewalk outside felt like an escape from a suffocating prison. Yet I couldn't fully shake the feeling that something had trailed me up from the depths. Even today, I can't say with certainty what really happened in that subterranean world of flickering lights and stale air. I continue to visit the building, more cautiously now, always on guard for that faint shimmer at the edge of my vision or any unnatural stillness. My mind still replays the moment the elevator doors opened onto the same lobby I had just left, as though reality itself had twisted on its axis. The figure of the guard, translucent and slowed as if caught in a different timeline, remains etched in my memory like a deep scar. To this day, I avoid sublevels whenever possible. Every so often, I sense that strange hush in the air, a sharp tension that prickles my nerves, reminiscent of that night. I can't prove anything to anyone, and I'm left to wrestle with my own recollections, haunted by the possibility that there are places in this world where logic falters and shadows overlap with the realm of the impossible. Whether it was a ghost, a parallel dimension, or a malfunction of the mind, I'll never truly know. But I do know that when the mundane rhythms of life dissolve into unnatural silence, and the comforting familiarity of a place disappears behind a warped reflection, fear takes on a weight all its own, a heavy, suffocating presence that refuses to let go. And that knowledge clings to me now, an uneasy reminder that sometimes you can step into a routine elevator and step out into a nightmare that defies all explanation. The moment I first set foot inside that house, I felt something was off. The air was stale and unnaturally cold, as though the walls had been holding their breath for decades. I remember standing in the living room, staring at the narrow staircase leading to the upper floor. It creaked under my slightest touch, as if warning me, "Go back while you can." But I pushed that feeling aside, convincing myself it was just an old building with character. How wrong I was. I had purchased this two-story house at a suspiciously low price. Situated in a quiet neighborhood, it looked normal enough from the outside. Pale walls, a small front porch, and tall windows that gave it a certain old-fashioned charm. The real estate agent mentioned it had been on the market for a while, but offered no explanation as to why. I assumed it was just the sagging economy or the outdated decor. Regardless, the deal seemed too good to pass up. With a mixture of excitement and mild apprehension, I signed the papers and moved in a few weeks later. From the onset, I chose to live primarily on the ground floor. The layout was convenient: a modest living room, a worn-down kitchen, and a small bedroom near the back. The top floor remained mostly empty, storing a handful of bulky old furniture left behind by the previous owner. I told myself I would get around to fixing it up eventually. For the time being, I preferred not to climb those rickety stairs. Perhaps some instinct was telling me it was best to keep my distance. The first few nights were quiet, with only the usual sounds of an aging house, the groaning of pipes, the distant gurgle of the plumbing. But around the end of the first week, I began to hear something else. Soft, rhythmic thuds and a dragging noise, as though heavy objects were being moved across the floor directly above my head. At first, I dismissed it as typical house settling. Yet the sounds grew louder, more deliberate, always starting after midnight. On a particularly restless evening, I remember clutching my bed sheets with clammy fingers, while the scraping noise upstairs seemed to circle above me. My heart thudded in my chest, and I caught myself holding my breath, as if bracing for the moment something would crash right through the ceiling. Against my better judgment, I decided to go investigate around 3 in the morning. My footsteps were reluctant, each step heavier than the last as I climbed the stairs. The closer I got, the more I sensed a sour tang in the air. Strong, acrid, reminiscent of sulfur. The hallway upstairs was dimly lit by a single overhead bulb that flickered at odd intervals. Every flicker twisted my own shadow against the walls, making it seem as if something else was moving beside me. The door to the main bedroom stood ajar. Just looking at it made me queasy. The moment I stepped inside, I was confronted by the sight of the antique bed frame pushed halfway across the room, chairs scattered randomly, and a strong, foul odor that made my eyes water. I circled the room in disbelief. I had not been upstairs since moving in, and I certainly hadn't rearranged any of the furniture. My pulse hammered in my ears, and a clammy sweat broke out across my forehead. My throat was dry as sand, yet my tongue felt coated with the bitter taste of dread. I forced myself to search for any logical explanation. Maybe the floor was uneven, I told myself. Maybe the furniture slid when the house settled. That rationalization felt hollow even as I formed it in my mind. Still, I returned to the ground floor, determined to forget this incident. The rest of that night passed fitfully. I lay awake, heart racing, imagining footsteps pacing in the rooms above. During the following days, oddities continued to escalate. Doors I had left locked were found open. The faint smell of sulfur occasionally wafted through the kitchen. My reflection in mirrors felt strange, as though my eyes were just a fraction of a second behind my movements, giving me a nauseating vertigo whenever I looked at myself too long. At times, I thought I heard the faint murmur of voices, or perhaps just one voice, on the second floor, muffled by the ceiling, yet distinct enough that I knew it wasn't just the wind. I tried to ignore these occurrences, burying myself in work during the day, but each night I found myself growing more restless. My body was tense, my appetite non-existent, and a perpetual sense of being watched hung over me. When a neighbor once asked through the fence if everything was okay, she might have heard me pacing in the backyard in the early hours. I managed to reply that it was just the house making odd sounds. But in truth, I felt as if the place were testing my boundaries, waiting for me to break. About 2 weeks in, something happened that shattered any fragile excuses I had left. I had been asleep, drifting in and out of troubled dreams, when a loud crash from upstairs jolted me awake. My heart thumped like it was about to leap out of my chest. The impulse to freeze and hope it went away battled with the duty to investigate. Ultimately, I mustered the courage to climb the stairs again. The air grew cooler with each step, and the sulfuric stench became suffocating. I stood in the hallway, beads of sweat rolling down my neck despite the chill. My hands trembled so violently that I was sure I'd dropped the flashlight I carried. As I reached the main bedroom door, I noticed it was slightly ajar once more. Suddenly it swung open on its own, creaking ominously, revealing the dark interior. I swear my heart skipped a beat, and my lungs seized. In the middle of that blackness, a shape hovered, a faint, tall outline, darker than the shadows around it. It was like a silhouette cut out from the night itself, lacking detail or identifiable features. My legs threatened to buckle, a wave of cold sweat spreading down my spine. In my stunned silence, the shape moved, gliding forward and sending a burst of frigid wind into the hallway. My flashlight flickered, and I swore I heard a low growling hum that resonated in my bones. The creature, or whatever it was, seemed to distort the air around it, the edges dissolving like a fine mist. Then, as though a gust of wind had blown through, the silhouette evaporated into thin smoke. Instantly, the temperature in the hallway returned to normal, and the sulfur smell dissipated, leaving me with only the echoes of my own ragged breathing. From that night on, the nocturnal disturbances took on a new cadence. The knocks and dragging sounds became more rhythmic, almost calculated, as if someone, or something, wanted me to follow that macabre invitation upstairs. My nerves were so frayed that I jumped at every minor sound, a floorboard creak, a faucet drip, even a sigh of wind against the window. I felt cornered in my own home, as though the upper floor was a predator, and I was its prey, too stubborn or too foolish to leave. My mind began to twist itself into knots. During the day, everything seemed normal under the sunlight, yet I found myself checking every corner, every door, expecting to see that shape lurking in plain sight. I started to fear the approach of night. Dread knotted in my stomach each evening as darkness fell, my skin crawling with the memory of that entity gliding toward me. I hardly slept, and when I did, my dreams were plagued by swirling shadows and that nauseating sulfur scent. In a desperate attempt at rationality, I considered looking for an explanation that had nothing to do with the supernatural. Was there some kind of gas leak causing hallucinations? Could a vagrant have broken into the second floor? But no matter how many times I circled the house, checking windows, vents, and floors, I found no logical culprit. Every night, the rhythmic pounding persisted, beckoning me to that cursed upper level, its tempo rising until the walls vibrated with each impact. One evening, I forced myself to ignore the thumping and tried to distract my mind by tidying the kitchen. A trickle of sweat ran down my back despite the mild temperature. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped a glass. The shatter on the tile made me flinch violently. Adrenaline surged through my veins and I felt close to a breaking point. Instead of going upstairs to investigate the fresh round of knocking, I cowered in the corner, hugging my knees and willing it all to stop. Over the next few days, my paranoia flourished. I caught my own reflection in the window and thought it twitched when I stood still. I heard faint footsteps behind me in the hallway, though no one was there. My heartbeat rarely returned to a normal pace. It was either racing or hammering heavily in my chest. A numb terror settled into my daily routine. I considered leaving, but the thought of abandoning the place after investing my savings and not knowing if the house's malevolence would follow me kept me rooted. I even visited a local hardware store to buy new locks for the upstairs rooms. My plan was to seal off that floor entirely, but the store clerk noticed my pallor and the tremor in my voice. He asked if I needed help with an installation or if there was a problem at my home. I muttered some half-hearted excuse about an older property needing extra security. My voice sounded hollow, even to me. When I returned and began fitting the new locks, I had to face the second floor again. The hallway was dim, the single overhead light flickering as usual. The smell of sulfur was faint but present, pricking at the back of my nostrils. I marched forward, trying to ignore the goosebumps rippling across my arms. When I reached the door of the main bedroom, I noticed it was closed this time. I held my breath for a moment, pressing my ear to the wood. I could hear a faint, almost imperceptible rustling inside. My heart pounded in my throat. With trembling hands, I slid the key into the lock I had just installed earlier. The tumbler turned with a click. For a split second, an overwhelming sense of relief washed over me. I had locked away the problem. I had taken action, but as I turned to walk away, a deep, resonant knock came from inside the room. 3 precise knocks, so powerful I could feel them vibrate through the door and into my bones. I nearly toppled backward, terror coursing through my veins like ice water. My palm slipped off the doorknob, slick with sweat. I raced downstairs, each step reverberating in my skull. I slammed the door to my ground floor bedroom behind me and slid down against the wall, struggling to breathe. That night I stayed awake, lights on, a baseball bat clutched in my hand, as if that would do anything against what I had witnessed. The knocks continued periodically, in sets of 3, echoing from above. A part of me was convinced the entity was mocking my feeble attempt to lock it away. Another part of me feared that every knock was loosening the last threads of my sanity, the steady tempo hammering at my fragile composure. By the following morning, I felt raw, as if the nights of terror had eroded my very sense of self. My muscles ached from constant tension, and my eyes were bloodshot. The idea of confronting that presence one more time made my stomach churn with dread. Yet something in me insisted I couldn't go on living in limbo, terrified of every nightfall. I decided I had to confront the thing upstairs, or at least force it to leave me in peace. Gathering a flashlight, I headed up in broad daylight, reasoning that sunlight might at least keep the worst at bay. The hallway was just as dim and unsettling under the midday sun. That awful sulfur smell lingered. My new lock on the bedroom door was intact, but the door itself sat slightly ajar. The lock had been turned from the inside. A fresh wave of cold terror gripped me, though I forced myself to push the door open. This time, the furniture was not merely rearranged. It was stacked in an impossible configuration. The bed frame leaned upright against the wall, and the chairs were balanced atop one another, like a bizarre totem. My mouth went dry and my breathing grew shallow. Each exhalation came out in a trembling hiss. In the center of the room, I saw a dark, swirling form. It shifted and pulsed, almost like living smoke. My body erupted in goosebumps, and I fought the urge to flee. The figure quivered, expanding in size, then coalesced into that same tall silhouette I'd seen before. With a sudden rush of air, it moved closer. My heart drummed so violently that my vision blurred. I felt the temperature drop precipitously, a frosty sting radiating from my chest down to my fingertips. My teeth chattered, and I wondered if I was seconds away from fainting. I stood there, fighting the urge to run, and did the only thing I could think of. I demanded, in a trembling voice, that it leave. The words came out ragged, more a plea than a command. I never heard a direct response, but I felt a ripple in the air, a tangible wave of hostility. The silhouette shuddered, as if in agitation, and then it lunged forward. A piercing ring filled my ears, and a vicious wind knocked me backward against the wall. My shoulder struck the plaster hard, pain exploding through my arm. My flashlight clattered away, spinning beam casting erratic shadows. Through my half-lidded eyes, I watched as the shape broke apart again into swirling tendrils of black smoke. For several heart-stopping seconds, I couldn't move or breathe. My mind reeled with the shock of what had just happened. Finally, I managed to scramble to my feet, ignoring the pain lancing through my shoulder. The air was thick and freezing, making my lungs burn. I felt sure my sanity was slipping away, yet I forced my legs to carry me out of the room and down the stairs. My only coherent thought was to escape, to put as much distance as possible between me and that malevolent presence. I rushed to the front door, nearly stumbling on the last step. An uncontrollable tremor took hold of my hands as I fumbled with the lock. When I finally burst outside, sunlight hit my face like a salvation I'd never appreciated before. I stood there panting, heart pounding so loud it seemed to vibrate in my skull. I didn't care if the neighbors saw me in that state. I was just grateful to be out of that suffocating darkness. For several minutes, I hovered near the house, debating whether to go back in for my phone or car keys. In the end, I told myself I had to re-enter, at least to secure my belongings. Summoning courage from desperation, I slipped back in and found them on the kitchen table. Every muscle screamed for me to get out as quickly as possible. I felt an unsettling awareness that something upstairs might be watching, even if it remained unseen in the daylight. I left the house, unsure if I would ever return. Yet as soon as I stepped beyond the gate, I sensed an inexplicable draw, as though an invisible chain stretched between me and that second floor. My thoughts spiraled. Was I truly safe if I just left? Could that presence reach me elsewhere? The weight of uncertainty bore down on me like a physical force, making me question my every step, my every breath. Even now, as I sit in a temporary rental a few miles away, I still hear those knocks in my mind. My nights remain restless. I wake up sweating, convinced I hear rhythmic pounding coming from the walls. The sensation of the freezing wind and the rancid smell of sulfur continue to haunt my senses. Sometimes I jolt awake, heart hammering, convinced that dark shape is standing just beyond the door. Rational thought tells me it's just trauma playing tricks, but a deeper part of me is sure the connection to that house, and whatever dwells in it, remains unbroken. I don't know if I'll ever set foot inside that place again. Yet a dreadful fascination tugs at the corners of my mind, urging me to go back, as if finishing a story that refuses to end on its own. It's an echo of the same thrumming invitation that pulsed through the floorboards night after night. Even now, despite the terror, I feel that quiet, insistent call, whispering that there is unfinished business. I'm torn between the primal need to stay away and the gnawing question of whether that malevolent presence might have already marked me. When I close my eyes, I'm back in that dark corridor, eyes fixed on a silhouette of pure void, my lungs straining for air as the cold closes in. In the end, I haven't found closure. I don't know that I ever will. The memory of that house clings like a second skin, a lingering sulfuric taste on my tongue. Even at a safe distance, I sense its pull, a silent promise that one day I may be compelled to return. And if I do, I doubt I'll leave it unscathed again. For now, all I can do is cling to the present moment, hoping the relentless pounding in my mind fades. Yet deep down, I suspect it never will. I've walked through the threshold of something that transcends locked doors and empty rooms. No matter where I go, it follows, quiet and implacable, an unspoken vow that my terror has only just begun. I remember the very first night I sensed something was wrong. The sky seemed too dark, the wind too cold, and every rustling branch sounded like a warning. There was a prickling on the back of my neck that refused to let me sleep. Outside my bedroom window, the silhouette of the old oak tree was barely discernible against the midnight sky, but I swore I saw movement at its base. That was when I realized a peaceful life in a secluded place can transform into something unnervingly quiet, leaving just enough space for fear to breed. I moved to the countryside longing for solitude. My small ranch, nestled between rolling hills and dense patches of forest, offered just the isolation I thought I needed. After a few months, I was gifted a peculiar iron statue by a colleague who visited one weekend. He mentioned that it depicted a wolf, and I recall him joking that it would watch over the property. I set it outside, right by that great oak tree, thinking it would serve as some sort of silent guardian. In daylight, the statue's dark metal glistened with a dull sheen, and I considered it a charming addition to the landscape. But in the gloom of late evening, something about it felt off. The wolf's stance was a frozen snarl, its muzzle tilted upward as if in mid-growl, and I often caught myself glancing through the window to confirm it was still there. Even then, I sensed an unusual gravity pulling my focus toward it. Several nights passed uneventfully, but I noticed the environment had an unfamiliar heaviness. My morning coffee on the porch used to bring a sense of calm. I would watch the birds at the feeder, trace the drifting clouds, and relish the hush of the distant trees. Lately, though, every time the wind blew through the forest, I heard a low murmur under the leaves, almost like a whisper. At first, I blamed my imagination. After all, living alone can breed strange thoughts, especially if you have an overactive mind. Yet the sensation that something lingered beyond my line of sight only grew stronger. One evening, as I sat inside reading, I heard a shuffle on the gravel outside. My heart jolted, and I nearly dropped my book. I peered through a small gap in the curtains, but I saw nothing beyond faint moonlight shining on the yard. The oak tree, with its colossal trunk, seemed to stretch taller than ever before, looming like a silent sentinel over my domain. I tried to calm myself, convincing my racing thoughts that it must have been a raccoon or perhaps a stray dog. Still, I felt my pulse hammering beneath my skin as I peered through the window. The first time I actually caught sight of it, this dark shape that resembled a wolf, was around a week after placing the iron statue. It was dusk, the last glimmer of sunset fading, and I was locking up the barn. Out of the corner of my eye, near the edge of the clearing, I spotted movement. My muscles froze, and my breathing stopped for a second. I turned my head slowly, trying not to alarm whatever creature stood there. In the gathering darkness, I saw a hulking silhouette. It was larger than any wolf or coyote I'd encountered. I couldn't make out details, only the broad shape and a pair of glowing, silver-like eyes fixed on me. The stare seemed almost too focused, too intelligent. The instant I flicked on my flashlight, it was gone. My heart pounded so hard I could feel the pressure in my eardrums. I scanned the area, trying to rationalize what I had just seen, but there was only an empty stretch of grass and the looming tree. That night, I barely slept. My mind replayed the image of those eyes. A primal fear seeped into my chest, making my breathing ragged. I tried telling myself it was just a trick of the light or a wandering dog, but something deeper insisted otherwise. I woke up multiple times, drenched in sweat, convinced I heard howling somewhere far off. The next morning, my reflections felt absurd. Still, I walked carefully around my yard, searching for paw prints. The grass revealed nothing definitive, though I found strange impressions near the oak's roots, as if something heavy had pressed down the soil. My fingers trembled as I bent to touch the marks. They were too vague to identify, but they gave me an uneasy shiver. Days passed in a blur of tension. The statue by the oak tree seemed to watch me whenever I was outside. Its snarling features were eerily realistic. When I approached it from certain angles, the eyes appeared to follow my movements. Sometimes I thought I could hear a metallic echo if I brushed against it, a hollow ring that lingered far longer than it should. I tried not to dwell on it too much, but every time I walked back into the house, I felt compelled to glance over my shoulder at that iron wolf. In my more paranoid moments, I had the impulse to grab it and toss it into the nearest ditch, but I always resisted. Part of me, perhaps, was in denial. If I disposed of it, would that not be acknowledging that something was truly amiss? I recall telling a friend over the phone that I kept seeing an animal lurking around the property. They suggested it might be a lone wolf that had strayed from its pack, or simply a trick of rural nights playing on my nerves. I found no comfort in that. Every evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the property took on a disquieting aura. The forest shadows stretched longer, the rustling of underbrush seemed louder, and every so often, I heard a distant yipping or howl that made my skin crawl. Sometimes I would sit in my living room, lights off, just listening. The worst part was the silence that followed a howl. The emptiness felt like an echo in my own chest, a harbinger of something I couldn't name. The nights of the full moon were the worst. The pale light bathed the clearing in an otherworldly glow. I'd peek out from behind the curtains and see the oak tree's branches swaying in a slow, rhythmic dance. One of those nights, I could have sworn I saw a silhouette moving around the trunk. It had the form of a large four-legged beast, its back almost level with the lower branches. My breath caught in my throat. My heart thumped painfully against my ribs. In a surge of reckless courage, I grabbed a flashlight, throwing the door open and shining the beam toward the tree. Nothing. The yard was empty, the statue of the wolf standing eerily still. Yet the air felt charged, electric. My hand trembled so badly that the flashlight's beam jerked across the ground in erratic patterns. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night breeze. During the day, I found no sense of relief. Instead, I became hyper-vigilant. A twig snapping under my foot made me jump. The rustle of leaves from a passing breeze set my nerves on edge. The oak tree's presence towered over me, a silent reminder of what I thought I saw at night. I began to suspect that I might be losing my grip on reality. More than once I caught myself searching every corner of my property, as if expecting to find that monstrous shape lying in wait. I couldn't focus on simple tasks. Even preparing lunch felt like a chore. My palms would sweat. My heart would accelerate at the faintest sound. Was it footsteps? Was it breath? I started second-guessing my own senses. One afternoon, I stepped outside and discovered fresh scratches on the bark of the oak. They looked deep and ragged, as though a large creature had sharpened its claws there. I touched the bark, feeling the torn wood edges crumble under my fingertips. My stomach churned with a mixture of fear and fascination. I tried rationalizing that it might be some large cat or a wild animal, but deep down, I remembered those silvery eyes. My adrenaline spiked, and a cold sweat trickled down my neck. I felt like I was being watched even then, a prickling at the back of my scalp that made me whip my head around in alarm. No one was there, at least no one I could see. Whenever I attempted to talk to neighbors, who lived quite a few miles away, I resorted to vague descriptions. I spoke about a prowler or a potential wild predator. One neighbor offered to help me set up traps, but I insisted it was nothing, feeling a near-delirious embarrassment that I couldn't quite explain. How could I convey that it wasn't a normal animal in question? How could I say I felt an unnatural intelligence in that creature's gaze, something beyond the primal cunning of typical wildlife? I kept the truth to myself, each day growing more isolated in my swirling doubts. My appetite waned, and I often found myself pacing the floors at odd hours. Sometimes in the dead of night, I'd wake with a jolt, convinced I heard scraping against the outer walls. Other times, the howling seemed so close, it made the window panes vibrate. My heart would race uncontrollably, and I'd feel a dryness in my mouth, a sticky dread that made every swallow difficult. My body ran on high alert around the clock, tensed muscles coiled to bolt at any sign of danger. The nights blurred into each other until the day I finally decided to confront the statue. I couldn't stand the sense of oppression any longer. Something about that iron figure felt like the root of it all. I remember stepping onto the porch in the early afternoon. The sky was a brittle gray, and the breeze carried the scent of rain. The oak tree looked ominous even under daylight, its thick boughs seeming to cast shadows that defied the weak sunlight. My heart pounded at the thought of touching that wolf statue, but I forced myself to move forward. Each step toward the tree felt heavier than the last, as if my body fought me, urging me to turn back. When I reached the statue, I noticed an odd discoloration on its surface, a faint blackish stain near the muzzle that hadn't been there before. I knelt, trying to rub it away, but it seemed ingrained in the metal. A jolt of alarm shot through me as I felt the statue's surface. It was strangely warm, despite the afternoon's chill. My palms started to sweat, and my breath came in shallow bursts. I told myself it was just residual heat from the sun, yet the overcast sky contradicted that explanation. An unsettling feeling rooted in my gut. Determined, I grabbed the statue's base to lift it. A shock ran through my arms. Whether it was static or my own nerves, I couldn't be sure. My heart pounded, and a wave of dizziness washed over me. In that moment, the wind picked up, rustling the branches overhead. It sounded like a low growl reverberating through the oak leaves. My vision blurred slightly, and I felt lightheaded. I tried to steady myself, but the feeling of that warm iron under my fingers made my stomach twist. I managed to pull the statue an inch or two before stumbling back, breath ragged. I stared at it, chest heaving, as if it were a living thing. Then, I heard the distant howl, a deep, resonant cry that rolled across the clearing. My arms broke out in goosebumps, and the hair on my neck stood on end. Every fiber of my being told me to run, so I did. I left the statue where it was, sprinting back to the house, lungs burning. Inside, I locked every door and closed every curtain. My heart hammered, and my hands shook uncontrollably. My mind reeled with questions. Was the statue truly connected to that nocturnal creature? Was I conjuring all of this in my head? Or had something unexplainable latched onto my home? I pulled a chair up to the window, parted the curtain just enough to see the oak tree, and waited. Outside, the rain began in earnest, slicking the grass and tapping against the roof in an endless, nerve-wracking staccato. Time crawled. The minutes stretched into hours as the sky darkened. When night finally fell, I could scarcely breathe. I waited and watched for any sign of movement near the tree. As if on cue, the wind hushed, and the pounding rain softened to a whisper. My eyelids felt heavy, but I refused to let them close. Then I saw it. A massive form circling the oak's trunk, its dark fur blending with the shadows. Lightning flashed far in the distance, and for a split second, I saw the creature in stark contrast. It was definitely larger than any real wolf. Its back was almost at the height of the statue's snarling muzzle. My body seized with adrenaline. I leaned forward, pressing my forehead against the cold glass. I watched the silhouette bow its head toward the iron figure as though acknowledging it. In that brief flash, the animal lifted its gaze toward my window. My blood turned to ice at the sight of those silver eyes. They shone with an unsettling brilliance, reflecting the lightning that flickered behind the clouds. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. The yard was empty again, except for the unwavering presence of that iron wolf. I nearly collapsed from the tension. My legs shook as I stumbled back from the window. I felt sweat trickling down my face, my breath ragged and uneven. I had to get out of this suffocating atmosphere, at least for a moment. Without thinking, I grabbed my coat and car keys. My hands trembled so badly I dropped the keys twice on the floor. Racing outside, I braced myself for another confrontation. But the yard was eerily still, with nothing but the sound of distant thunder. I jumped into my car and started the engine, needing to feel that surge of movement. I backed out of the driveway, trying to ignore how the statue looked in my rearview mirror. Its jaws parted in a silent snarl against the backdrop of the ancient oak. I drove aimlessly for over an hour, circling the rural back roads with no destination in mind, desperate to shake off the feeling of being watched. My reflection in the rearview mirror frightened me. I saw a man on the brink of panic, eyes wide, lips pressed together in a tight line. Eventually, I parked at a small convenience store, went inside, and tried to calm myself under the harsh fluorescent lights. I grabbed a bottle of water, barely able to steady my grip as I drank. My mind churned with possibilities. Should I abandon the ranch altogether? Should I call someone for help? A swirl of shame and fear kept me silent. Who would believe me if I explained the full story? I returned to the property just after midnight, bracing myself for more terrors. Surprisingly, the yard was quiet, the oak tree looming in darkness. My pulse throbbed in my temples, but I forced myself to approach the statue. It stood there exactly as before, immovable and unsettling. The stains on its muzzle looked darker in the moonlight, and the metal felt oddly cool now. Something changed the moment I laid eyes on it again. A wave of resolve broke through my fear. I decided that if this entity or presence was somehow linked to the statue, I wouldn't let it continue to dominate my life. I didn't have to destroy it. Part of me feared that might make things worse, but I could remove it from this place. The next morning, under the dismal gray dawn, I wrapped the statue in a thick blanket, half expecting it to burn my skin through the fabric. But it felt inert, despite my rising anxiety. My heart thundered as I loaded it into the back of my pickup truck. Then I drove, not looking in the rearview mirror once, until I found a storage facility a few towns over. I rented a small unit in cash and shoved the statue into the far corner, covering it with a tarp. As I locked up the unit, I felt a momentary wave of relief. An unspoken dread still lodged in my chest, but I convinced myself that I had broken the link. Back at the ranch, the air felt lighter, though my nerves were still on edge. The oak tree seemed less ominous, just a centuries-old giant swaying in the breeze. For the rest of that day and evening, I found no new tracks, heard no howls, and felt no phantom presence. My chest expanded with cautious hope. I stepped onto the porch that night, scanning the shadows, but everything was still. The forest rustled in a harmless lullaby, and I allowed myself to breathe deeply for the first time in weeks. Inside, I managed to sleep through the night without jolting awake. No nightmares, no monstrous silhouettes at my window. By the next morning, I should have been at ease. Yet, when I looked out at the oak tree, I swore I saw a faint outline of something large brushing against the trunk. My heart clenched and I froze, staring until my vision blurred. There was nothing there. No shape, no wolf, just swaying branches. Still, a familiar dread crept through my veins. Even without the statue, the sense of being watched remained, as though the quiet spaces around me held their breath. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. Had the link truly been broken, or was it never about the statue at all? I felt my heart pound, my palms growing slick with sweat. The fear lingered, not as an overt threat, but like an echo in the corners of my perception. I realized with a slow twist in my stomach that I might never fully escape the uncertainty. Whether this presence was tied to the iron wolf, or to the land itself, or even to my own imagination, it had branded me with a raw, haunting awareness of the unknown. And every rustle of the leaves, every whisper of wind, now carried the potential to reveal something dark lurking just out of sight. I haven't left the ranch permanently. Something keeps me here, perhaps curiosity or a grim sense of pride. I'm more alert now, always listening, watching for a silhouette that I sometimes think I glimpse in the corner of my eye. There's a restless hush around the oak tree, as if it shelters secrets among its roots and branches. I don't know if I'll ever see that beast clearly, face to face, or if it even exists in the way I believe. All I know is that at dusk, when the shadows grow long, my pulse quickens, and I find myself peering into the tree line. My chest tightens, my breath falters, and a chill crawls along my skin. In those moments, fear gnaws at me with an intensity I never knew before, reminding me that the boundaries between the real and the imagined can be perilously thin. And though I've removed that iron statue, I can't seem to banish the lingering presence. It remains woven into the silence of these nights, a vague shape circling the oak whenever I let my guard down. Perhaps it's my own paranoia, forging apparitions out of darkness. Or maybe there really is something beyond human understanding, drawn here by the old wood and twisted metal. Whatever the truth, I live now in a perpetual state of uneasy vigilance, braced for the possibility that some evening, when I least expect it, I'll look out into the yard and see those silver eyes shining back at me once again. I sensed something was wrong the moment I turned the key in that rusted lock. There was a tension in the air, a clammy pressure that pressed against my lungs and made it hard to take a full breath. The hallway lights flickered above me, buzzing with an electric hum that vibrated in my bones. Even before I dragged my suitcases across the scuffed wooden floors, I felt that this apartment had a presence of its own, like it was holding its breath, waiting for me. And so began my nights in the top floor of an old downtown building that refused to let me sleep peacefully. I moved in on a damp afternoon, carrying boxes and furniture up 5 flights of stairs because the elevator was perpetually out of service. The manager had mumbled something about not trusting that old contraption, but I barely paid attention. I was fixated on the high ceilings, the large windows, and the idea of living in a place that had so much history etched into its walls. I felt a mixture of excitement and unease as I slid open those warped windows, letting the city's stale heat seep in. The wood beneath my feet groaned whenever I shifted my weight, but I brushed it off as a quaint architectural quirk. Little did I know how that persistent creaking would come to sound like muffled screams in the nights to follow. For the first few days, the main inconvenience was the flickering overhead lights. Every time I turned on a switch, the fixture would blink several times before settling into a weak, uneven glow. I replaced bulbs, inspected the old fuses, and even called a friend with some electrical know-how to check if the wiring was compromised. He said everything looked old but functional. I assumed that was the end of it. Yet the buzzing never stopped. Every lamp, every outlet, every light switch seemed to emit a nervous static. In quiet moments, I could hear faint crackles as if something flowed through the wires with malevolent intent. When night fell, the illusions of normalcy vanished. The floors became a symphony of creaks and moans, each step eliciting a new whine from the ancient wood. In the silence, I could swear there was a pattern, a subtle rhythm that followed me from room to room. The first real scare happened when the television turned on by itself. I was finishing a late meal in the kitchen when I heard the muffled hiss of static. At first, I thought a neighbor's set was on too loud. But no, it was coming from my living room. I found the TV alive, flipping channels in a jittery dance of color and noise. I switched it off manually, chalking it up to a faulty remote or a random surge. But that night, it switched itself back on 3 times. Each time, the channels raced from one station to another in a nauseating blur. I unplugged it from the wall to make it stop. After a handful of restless nights, I woke up in the pre-dawn hush to a sudden flash in the corridor, like a lightning strike trapped indoors. The brightness burned across my retinas, leaving dark spots floating in my vision. My heart lurched into my throat, and I jumped out of bed, stumbling over a pile of half-unpacked boxes. When I reached the hallway, everything was black again. No smell of smoke, no sign of anything scorched. The light fixture looked intact. I clicked the switch on and off, half expecting it to explode. It didn't. The hallway just flickered weakly, and I stood there in the dim glow, trying to steady my breathing. But that episode marked the beginning of far more intense disturbances. One by one, my lamp started to burn out. Each time it happened, there was a sharp pop, like a glass capsule bursting under high pressure. Tiny sparks shot out, sometimes leaving scorch marks on the ceiling or the shade. My fingers twitched with anxiety every time I approached a switch, afraid it might detonate a bulb in my face. I could barely sleep. The hairs on my arms constantly stood on end, as if a faint current was running through me. My muscles would tense at every noise, every hiss of static. I tried explaining it to the building manager, using calm but urgent words. He simply shrugged and said the building was old, the wiring was tricky, and that I should just be careful. I asked him if the previous tenant had ever mentioned anything like this. He paused, glancing at me with a hint of unease, and said that person never complained about such things. Maybe it was my imagination, but I detected a flicker of reluctance in his eyes, like he knew more than he was letting on. He told me not to worry, that he would look into it, but I doubted his sincerity. My days became consumed with trying to solve these electric mysteries. I had an electrician come over. He checked the outlets, the breakers, every fixture. He told me, in a perplexed tone, that while the wiring was old, it wasn't nearly as faulty as my experiences suggested. The official explanation didn't match the endless array of anomalies I was living through. Nights were the worst. I'd lie awake, heart pounding, listening to the relentless crackle within the walls. It sounded like an army of insects crawling through the conduits, or a sinister intelligence rushing through every cable. My breathing grew ragged, and I could feel sweat trickling down my temples. Sleep came in fragments, haunted by nightmares of being electrocuted in my bed. The paranoia that I was being watched gnawed at me. Sometimes, as I stood in the hallway, I had the sensation of static fingertips brushing the back of my neck. The corners of the rooms felt darker than they should have been, as if the shadows had weight. Whenever I flipped a light switch, I did it tentatively, bracing for that sickening jolt of fear that came from hearing a sudden pop or seeing a spark fly. On more than one occasion, I had to leave the apartment in the middle of the night just to breathe fresh air and reassure myself the rest of the world was still normal. Even in those moments, an anxious flutter in my chest refused to calm. I felt I was tethered to that apartment by a malevolent force that wanted me inside, shivering in the dark. There were times I questioned my own sanity. Perhaps I'd become overly sensitive to normal building noises. Perhaps my mind fixated on the flickering lights, amplifying them into a horror show. I tried to laugh it off with a colleague during a lunch break, describing the bizarre events in half-serious detail. He nodded sympathetically, telling me I was under a lot of stress. That night, I attempted to block it all out with music. I put on headphones, cranked up the volume, and tried to focus on something besides the ceaseless electrical hum. But the moment I closed my eyes, the overhead light popped. Fragments of hot glass cascaded onto my bed, and a searing wave of panic clutched my gut. Adrenaline roared through my veins, my pulse drumming in my ears. By the time I cleaned up the shards, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the dustpan. I confronted my reflection in the bathroom mirror, trying to see if there was any glimmer of madness in my own eyes. They looked bloodshot and hollow, brimming with insomnia. My heart hammered against my ribcage like a caged animal, and I felt a dryness in my mouth that no amount of water could relieve. Something in that place was wearing me down, draining my resolve. With each flicker, each unexpected burst of static, I felt more fragile. The building seemed alive, its ancient bones resonating with a current of hostility. One particularly disturbing night, I heard a vibrating hum in the living room. My limbs felt heavy with dread as I approached the source. The TV had plugged itself back into the socket, the cord winding across the floor as if it had a life of its own. The screen was on, cycling through grainy channels. My breath hitched, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I yanked the cord out of the wall, only to watch the screen remain lit for a full 3 seconds before fading into darkness. It felt like a mocking demonstration of whatever force inhabited this apartment, an assertion that it didn't need a power source to manifest. Desperate for answers, I visited the basement of the building, hoping to find some clue in the fuse boxes or any sign of tampering. The air there was musty and thick with dust, making me cough into my sleeve. The lights flickered the same sickly yellow. Row after row of old electrical panels lined the walls, each labeled with numbers corresponding to the apartments. My heart throbbed in my ears as I examined the panel for my floor. Everything looked normal, no obvious damage or exposed wires. But I sensed I wasn't alone. The air felt charged, my skin prickling with an uncomfortable warmth. I left, feeling no more reassured than before. Days passed, and my fear evolved into something like dread-laced acceptance. I took to lighting candles at night, avoiding the overhead lamps as much as possible. The dull glow of the flames offered a fragile sense of security, but the shadows they cast seemed to ripple, shifting in ways that made my chest tighten. Even then, the silence was broken by short bursts of static from the appliances I kept unplugged. It was as if the current inside the walls crackled with malicious glee, feeding off my anxiety. The apartment became stifling, the air thick with a tension that made my lungs feel under siege. Each time I breathed in, it felt like inhaling a faint electric shock. Around this time, I began to experience fleeting moments where I questioned the boundary between waking and sleeping. I would open my eyes in the dark, convinced I heard whispering, but I could never locate its source. I'd see flashes of light from underneath the door, but find no evidence of anything abnormal in the hallway. My heart would gallop at these moments, sweat beating along my hairline. Every muscle in my body clenched, bracing for an attack that never came. The sense of being watched became overpowering, as if someone, or something, hovered just outside my line of sight. Eventually, my health started deteriorating. The constant adrenaline left me fatigued, with a perpetual ache behind my eyes. My appetite dwindled, and I subsisted on coffee and scraps of food. One afternoon, the manager stopped by and commented that I looked pale and shaken. He asked if things had improved. I told him it was getting worse, describing the nightly flashes, the shattered bulbs, the roaring static. He offered a half-hearted remark that it must be stress, then quickly changed the topic. I realized in that moment he wasn't going to help me. He either didn't believe me or didn't want to get involved. The breaking point arrived on a stormy night. Rain battered the windows and thunder rumbled in the distance. I had all the lights off, relying on 2 flickering candles. At first, the television flashed, even though it was still unplugged. Then the overhead fixture crackled like it was about to burst, sending arcs of bluish sparks across the ceiling. My pulse raced, my breath turning shallow and rapid. A low hum intensified, a resonance that felt like it was burrowing into my skull. The apartment's walls glowed faintly for a moment, as if electricity coursed beneath the paint. I'd never felt such raw, overwhelming fear. In that instant, I grabbed my keys and ran for the door, ignoring the frantic creaks of the wood beneath me. Sparks flickered overhead, trailing me down the hallway. It felt like the entire building's electrical system was rallying to chase me out. I bolted down the stairwell, adrenaline roaring in my ears. My lungs burned with every step, and it was only when I reached the lobby that I realized I was gasping like I'd sprinted a marathon. The manager gave me a startled look, but I couldn't form words. My eyes must have been wild with panic. I didn't return that night. Instead, I found a cheap hotel room across town, collapsing onto the bed with trembling limbs. My mind wouldn't rest, replaying the crackling lights, the popping bulbs, that intangible pressure of being watched. Part of me worried the phenomenon might follow me wherever I went, but the hotel was mercifully quiet. Over the next few days, I made arrangements to break my lease. It was complicated and expensive, but I didn't care. I felt an urgent need to escape before that place sank its claws any deeper into me. On my final day in the apartment, I braved the oppressive atmosphere to gather my belongings. I sensed the static humming in the walls, more subdued this time, yet still present like a predator watching from the shadows. Every hair on my body stood on end, and my heart fluttered in my chest. I hurried, packing only the essentials, leaving a few pieces of cheap furniture behind. The silence was punctured by occasional electrical snaps that made my pulse jump. I tried not to look at the scorch marks in the ceiling or the blackened ends of the bulbs that had exploded. As I locked the door for the last time, I felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Relief, certainly, like escaping a cage, but also a lingering dread, a knowledge that the apartment wasn't finished with me. The sense of being scrutinized remained, even in the corridor. It felt like the building itself was alive, hungry for something I refused to surrender. Once the door clicked shut, I stood in the hallway, hand trembling around the key. A final flicker pulsed through the dim overhead light, and I knew I had to turn away before I lost my nerve. Walking down the stairs, my body still vibrated with tension. My breath came in ragged bursts, and a cold sweat dampened the back of my shirt. Even outdoors, under the gray sky, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was coiled inside my mind, refusing to let go. The city traffic droned around me, normal and indifferent, unaware of the malevolence I'd left behind on the top floor. I had escaped, yet I wasn't free. Whenever I blinked, I saw the electric arcs dancing across the walls. The memory of that intense crackle haunted my ears, echoing in the silence whenever I closed my eyes. Now, when I recount those nights, my throat tightens and my pulse quickens as though I'm still caught in that corridor, stunned by a flash of impossible light. I've taken a new place in a modern building with fresh wiring and bright LED lamps that never flicker. Despite this, I jump whenever a bulb hums too loudly, and I sleep with my lights on more often than I care to admit. There's a lingering voice in my head, whispering that the entity I encountered wasn't bound to those ancient walls. Sometimes, in moments of quiet, I sense a faint static in the air, and I wonder if it found a new conduit, a new path to chase me down. Even now, I live in that shadow of uncertainty, bracing for the day it might switch itself back on. I felt the pressure in my ears before I heard the engines rumble, like a distant thunder rolling beneath my seat. The cabin lights flickered for half a second, just enough to make my heart jolt in my chest. I knew something was off as soon as I boarded the flight. My palms were clammy, and the overhead bin seemed to close around me like the jaws of some oversized creature. Even the air tasted stale. It was the type of tension that wraps around your lungs and won't let you breathe freely. I told myself it was just ordinary nerves, that I was imagining everything. But deep down, I suspected I was about to experience more than simple turbulence. Something was stirring in the unseen corners of my mind. Something that had been dormant for far too long. I have always hated flying, but I wasn't always like this. Back in the 1980s, I was enthralled by planes. I traveled constantly with my family, hopping from one city to another as if the world was my personal playground. The real reason for my fascination wasn't the destinations themselves, though. It was my aunt. She was a flight attendant. No, more than that. She was a force of nature in a crisp uniform, carrying stories of distant places like precious contraband. I hung on her every tale of the shimmering lights in Tokyo, the sun-baked runways in Cairo, the biting wind in London. She could paint pictures in my mind so vivid that I almost smelled the exotic spices, or felt the different textures of foreign sidewalks. Then she disappeared from my life. I never fully understood why, only that there were personal reasons, adult issues I was too young to grasp at the time. She faded from my world as swiftly as a plane passing through a cloud bank. After she left, I developed an irrational fear of flying. Well, maybe it wasn't irrational, but that's what everyone called it. They said I was overreacting. They said I had no basis for my anxiety. Inside, however, I felt as though I had lost my protective guide, the one who warded off any calamity at 30,000 feet. Without her presence, the skies felt cold and full of hidden threats. I tried to avoid air travel for years, but work demanded it. My job occasionally forced me onto planes. This particular flight, the one that would change everything, was supposed to be routine, a short hop between two major cities. I boarded with trembling hands, bracing myself for the inevitable jitters during takeoff. The flight started relatively uneventful. A slight rumble as we left the ground, a metallic clatter from the beverage carts. My heart was pounding even then, but I was somewhat used to it. I breathed in shallow bursts, reminding myself that thousands of flights took off and landed every day. Nothing extraordinary was going to happen. Midway through the flight, though, the turbulence came. It was sudden and aggressive, like the plane had been seized by a giant hand and shaken. My stomach lurched into my throat and I gripped the armrests, knuckles whitening. Lights flickered. The seatbelt sign dinged. I felt every muscle in my body tense, as if expecting the floor to drop out from beneath me. My heartbeat throbbed in my ears, a frantic tempo of primal fear. People around me seemed alarmed, though I tried not to look at them. I didn't want to let their reactions feed my terror. Instead, I closed my eyes, trying to retreat into a private fortress of calm. I must have drifted off at some point, despite the jolts. Maybe it was the sheer exhaustion of anxiety, or maybe it was a strange reflex of my mind shutting down to protect itself. But as soon as my eyelids grew heavy, I plunged into a dream that was both vivid and horrifyingly real. In it, I found myself standing in the middle of the airplane's aisle. The overhead lights were dim and flickering, casting long shadows that stretched and warped as the plane bucked. Everything looked wrong. Stained seats, torn fabric, windows that were fogged and cracked. It was as though the interior had aged centuries in a matter of moments, decaying around me in slow motion. Then I saw her, my aunt. She stood at the far end of the aisle, wearing an outdated flight attendant's uniform. It was the one I remembered from her old photos, complete with the crisp collar and a little scarf tied neatly around her neck. She reached out her hand toward me, her face frozen in a smile that felt unsettlingly broad, almost too wide for her cheeks. My heart hammered harder in the dream than it ever did in waking life. She appeared untouched by the ruin around her, like she existed outside the laws of normal reality. I tried to speak but found my throat constricted. The only sound was the faint creaking of the plane's worn-out interior, and a distant whistle, as if wind howled through unseen cracks. She took a step closer, then another. until she was standing right next to me. I could see every detail of her face, even the subtle lines at the corners of her eyes. When she finally clasped my hand, her skin felt icy. I thought I might recoil, but I couldn't move. I was pinned by her gaze, overwhelmed by a sensation that she was both protecting and possessing me. The dream's atmosphere reeked of musty upholstery and metal corrosion, an olfactory assault that lodged in my nostrils. My breath came in rapid, shallow gasps. Despite the terror, a strange part of me felt comforted, like a child who finally sees a familiar face in a haunted house. But there was no warmth in her expression. Her eyes sparkled with something that bordered on triumph. Suddenly, everything snapped into darkness. My eyes flew open and I jerked awake in my seat. My neck was stiff, and a line of sweat trailed down the back of my shirt. My fingers were numb from clutching the armrests too hard. For a second, I couldn't breathe. Panic strangled my throat. Then I noticed something equally startling. The turbulence was gone. It hadn't dissipated gradually. It was simply gone, as if a switch had been flipped. My fellow passengers looked around in confusion. A flight attendant strolled down the aisle, carefully checking on everyone. There was a visible unease in her eyes, though she tried to hide it behind a professional smile. I took long, shaky breaths. My heart pounded like I just sprinted a mile. My entire body tingled with electric tension, my hands trembling as I tried to wipe the sweat from my brow. But my mind was elsewhere, replaying the image of my aunt in that decrepit cabin. It felt too real to dismiss as a normal nightmare. Her presence clung to me, like a spectral residue. Was it just a product of my anxieties? Or had I truly encountered something beyond my understanding? The rest of the flight was unnervingly smooth. I kept waiting for more turbulence, for the seatbelt sign to flicker back on, for some announcement to break through the uneasy silence. But the plane glided through the air as if nothing had ever been wrong. That calm felt unnatural, too perfect, like the silence in a horror movie before the monster leaps out. When we finally landed, I practically sprang out of my seat, desperate for the solidity of the airport floor. My nerves still sizzled with adrenaline. My breathing was ragged, and my clothes clung to my damp skin. Over the following weeks, I couldn't shake the dream. My aunt's face haunted my thoughts. Every time I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was just a stress-induced nightmare, I failed. The memory was too vivid. The crisp detail of her uniform, the chill of her hand, the decaying airplane aisles, they all lingered in my mind's eye. I started to question whether something supernatural had touched me during that flight. I remembered how she used to say in a warm tone, though I only recalled it indirectly now, that she would always look out for me whenever I took to the skies. For a while, I took comfort in the idea that maybe she was keeping me safe from some alternate plane of existence. But then small, unsettling incidents began to accumulate. It started with fleeting sensations. I'd be alone in my apartment, and the temperature would drop inexplicably behind me. I'd feel a phantom breath on my neck while I washed dishes. Once, in a mirror, I thought I caught a glimpse of that old flight attendant uniform pass by behind my reflection. My knees nearly buckled, and when I whirled around, of course, there was nothing. My heart hammered out of my chest, leaving me trembling with disbelief and a hint of dread. Was I losing my mind? Or was she actually here? Sleep became elusive, because every time I drifted off, I returned to that decaying airplane. The dream progressed with each occurrence. One night, the seats seemed more torn, the windows more shattered. Another night, I saw flickers of lightning through the cracks in the fuselage, as if the plane was caught in a silent storm. And each time, my aunt appeared, unwavering in her pristine uniform, reaching for my hand. She never spoke. She just offered that too wide smile and guided me through the rancid corridor. When I woke, my pulse thundered, and the sheets were soaked with sweat. I caught myself checking the corners of my room, convinced she stood there, watching. One particularly restless evening, I decided to confront my fear. I rummaged through old photo albums, searching for pictures of my aunt in her flight attire. The images sent chills up my spine. She wore that same crisp outfit I saw in my dreams, right down to the color of her scarf. My anxiety rose, making my hands shake so badly I nearly dropped the albums. As I flipped through them, the overhead light in my living room began to flicker. The old bulb was on its last legs, maybe, or so I tried to tell myself. But it flickered in a pulse, almost like a heartbeat, and for a moment, I saw a faint silhouette on the wall. It had her shape. I felt my throat tighten, as though invisible fingers were pressing in. I slammed the album shut and retreated to my bedroom, but I couldn't escape the oppressive feeling that I was being observed. Things escalated the day I received a notification that I needed to take another flight for a work meeting. My stomach churned the second I saw the email. Every fiber of my being rebelled, urging me to call in sick or find some excuse to travel by train instead. But I had no choice. It was mandatory, and the flight was booked. The days leading up to the trip were a living hell. My senses were constantly on edge, every sound magnified. The humming of my refrigerator at night became a growl in the darkness. The tick of a clock felt like a drum inside my skull. My dreams persisted, growing more detailed in their nightmare quality. I started to suspect that each dream was trying to lure me deeper into that decaying plane, leading me to some revelation or confrontation. At the airport, I moved through the crowd feeling like a man walking to his own doom, although I reminded myself there would be no death, not in any literal sense. My breath was shallow, and a cold sweat covered my forehead. The other passengers looked normal enough, but in my hypervigilant state, I thought I saw my aunt's face among them. A flash of her eyes here, a glimmer of her smile there, as if she were flitting through the edges of my vision. By the time I boarded, my legs felt like jelly. The new plane was modern, bright, and smelled of sanitized air, yet I couldn't banish the memory of that disintegrating fuselage from my nightmares. We took off without incident. I tried to distract myself by counting each breath, forcing a deliberate inhale, a slow exhale. But the second the seatbelt sign turned off, the lights in the cabin dimmed unexpectedly. There was a hush, a collective confusion. I felt my pulse spike. Flight attendants exchanged concerned glances. Over the speakers, the captain explained we were experiencing a minor electrical malfunction, but assured us everything was under control. My mind raced with panic. The atmosphere became suffocating. It was as if the entire plane slid into a surreal twilight. Then came the scent, that unmistakable smell of moldy upholstery and rusted metal. My stomach turned, and I tried to breathe through my mouth, but the odor was overwhelming. It was the same smell from my recurring dream, clinging to the air like a toxic cloud. I pressed the call button overhead, desperately wanting to speak to a flight attendant, but no one came. Looking around, I noticed the rest of the passengers seemed oddly unaware of the stench. They shifted uneasily, but not with the level of horror I felt. My skin prickled, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. In a rush of dread, I glanced down the aisle. It was darker than it should have been, like the plane's length extended beyond logical space. At the far end, illuminated by a faint flicker of emergency lighting, I thought I saw my aunt. Her uniform stood out in sharp contrast to the gloom, every crease and color exactly as in my nightmares. She raised her hand, beckoning me. My breath caught in my throat. Sweat dripped down my temples, and my vision blurred around the edges as adrenaline flooded my system. Without thinking, I unbuckled my seatbelt and stumbled into the aisle, my legs so weak they threatened to give out. Step by step, I moved closer to her. My heart pounded painfully against my ribcage, each beat echoing in my ears. The overhead lights flickered again, and for a split second, the cabin appeared dilapidated, seats in tatters, the floor dotted with broken glass. My aunt's figure was still immaculate, unaffected by the decay. The flicker passed, and reality reasserted itself, the modern plane returning in a jarring snap. But each time the lights blinked, I saw glimpses of that other place. My vision swam with the merging images, making me feel like I was crossing some threshold between realms. I braced myself on a seatback, swallowing hard against the dryness in my throat. My mouth felt like sandpaper, my lips cracked. The air had become thick, as though I was inhaling water instead of oxygen. I tried to call out, to ask her why she was here, what she wanted, but my voice caught in a stifled croak. She only smiled, that unnervingly wide curve of her lips that seemed to contain a flicker of something beyond human understanding. I felt a tremor course through my body, muscles locking up as fear soared to a crescendo. Then, with terrifying suddenness, the lights came fully back on. The smell vanished. The plane returned to normal. My aunt was gone. Gasping, I realized I was standing in the aisle while other passengers gawked. A flight attendant rushed over, politely insisting I return to my seat. I could barely hear her over the roar of blood in my ears. I complied, buckling in with shaky hands. My heart was thumping so violently I wondered if everyone around me could hear it. The remainder of that flight was eerily calm again, much like my previous experience. We landed smoothly, and the tension in the cabin dissipated as if no one but me had sensed something amiss. I disembarked, numb with confusion and shock. As I stepped onto the jet bridge, I sensed a faint, lingering hint of that stale odor. It was gone in an instant, but it was enough to send one last tremor of dread through me. I don't know if my aunt is protecting me or haunting me. Maybe both. All I am certain of is that she is present whenever I fly, occupying a space between the real and the unreal. The planes I board feel like gateways, bridging the gap between my world and wherever she resides. Every time I step onto one, I expect to see her again, waiting in the shadows of a decaying aisle, extending her cold hand, reminding me of something I don't fully understand. I wish I could say I've found a resolution, that I've come to terms with her presence or uncovered the secret of her disappearance. But the truth is, the uncertainty gnaws at me daily. If I close my eyes, I can still see her in that uniform, smiling with unsettling warmth, as if promising both salvation and eternal observation. I've learned to live with this uneasy reality, that every time I board a plane, the veil might lift, and I'll find myself again in that crumbling cabin, guided by a person who shouldn't be there but undeniably is. And as disturbing as it is, a small part of me clings to the idea that she might just be keeping me safe in the only way she knows how. Even so, that thought does nothing to quiet the clammy dread that squeezes my chest whenever the engines roar. Because I can't escape the notion that her watchful presence is less about protecting me and more about never letting me go.